On the morning of October 19th, 1873, Caleb Mercer stood in the doorway of Tucker's Mercantile in Red Stone Creek, Wyoming Territory, and listened to three men laugh about the 2,800 pounds of potatoes he had hauled into a hole in the ground. The autumn wind pushed across the wooden boardwalk, carrying the smell of dust and dried sage from the hills beyond town. Inside, behind the counter made of rough pine boards, Vernon Tucker leaned on his elbows and grinned at two farmers who sat on upturned crates near the pot-bellied stove. The morning sun slanted through windows that had not been cleaned in months, catching the dust motes that drifted like snow in the still air. 2,800 pounds, Earl Hoskins said again, shaking his head so that his beard wagged like a dog's tail. The man hauled 2,800 pounds of potatoes into a cave. Samuel Brecht slapped his knee with a hand that was thick with calluses and scarred from a lifetime of working wire fences and branding irons. Lord Almighty, that is 20 wagon loads at least, he said. What does he figure on doing, feeding the badgers? Feeding himself, I expect, Vernon Tucker said from behind his counter, where he kept the account books that showed who owed what and who would never pay. Though a man who lives in a cave like a bear might be half badger himself for all we know. The laughter rolled through the store like water through a creek bed, easy and thoughtless and cruel in the way that small towns excel at cruelty without quite meaning it. Caleb did not step inside. He stood with his hat in his hands, a brown felt hat with a sweat-stained band, and a list of supplies folded in his coat pocket. He was 31 years old that October morning, lean and sharp-featured with the kind of quiet gray eyes that notice things other people walked past without seeing. He had come to town for salt, lamp oil, and 20 yards of cheesecloth to line his storage shelves. Instead, he had found his name being passed around like a joke between men who had never read a book that was not the Bible and who thought the height of learning was knowing when to plant corn. He put his hat back on and walked to the feed store instead. Words were just sounds. They could not hurt him unless he let them, and he had spent too many years listening to his father's disappointment to let the mockery of strangers touch him now. 7 months earlier, in March of that same year, Caleb had stood in a lawyer's office in Cheyenne and learned that his father, Nathaniel Mercer, had divided his estate among his 3 sons, with the precision of a man cutting a pie into unequal slices. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and through the window Caleb could see the muddy street where freight wagons rolled past on their way to somewhere more important than where they were. The lawyer, a thin man named Abernathy with spectacles that caught the light and hid his eyes, read from the will in a voice that suggested he had read many wills, and found them all equally tiresome. To my eldest son Jackson, Nathaniel Mercer had written, I leave the ranch house and 640 acres of bottomland along the Sweetwater River, together with 180 head of cattle bearing the Mercer brand, this property being valued at $14,000 or thereabouts. The land was good land, the kind that grew hay without much coaxing and kept cattle fat through summer. Jackson, who was 38 and had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's easy smile, nodded as though he had expected nothing less. He put his hand on Caleb's shoulder when the lawyer paused and said, I am sorry, little brother. I do not know what father was thinking, but there was no sorrow in Jackson's voice, only the careful tone of a man who knows he has won and wants to appear gracious about it. To my middle son Robert, the lawyer continued, I leave my sawmill operation and timber rights to 420 acres of old-growth pine on the north slope, this property and business being valued at $9,000 or thereabouts. Robert, who was 35 and had married a woman named Eleanor who believed herself better than she was, said nothing at all. His wife pressed her lips together and looked at Caleb with an expression that suggested he had gotten exactly what he deserved for spending his youth reading books instead of learning to work with his hands like a proper man should. To my youngest son Caleb, the lawyer read, and here his voice took on a note that might have been sympathy or might have been embarrassment. I leave 540 acres of hillside property along Redstone Creek, this land being of steep and rocky character, with no water rights and no timber of commercial value, estimated worth $800 if a buyer could be found who wanted such land. There was a pause during which Caleb could hear the clock on the wall ticking and the sound of a dog barking somewhere in the street outside. "That is all," the lawyer said, and closed the leather folder that held the will as though closing a door that should have been shut long ago. Caleb had in fact spent a good deal of his youth reading. While Jackson plowed and Robert split logs, Caleb had borrowed every volume he could find from the traveling preacher who came through twice a year, and from the schoolteacher who had stayed one winter before deciding that Wyoming was too cold and too empty for a man who loved books. He had read agricultural journals that explained the chemistry of soil and the rotation of crops. He had read geological surveys published by the United States government, thick volumes with fold-out maps that showed the layers of rock beneath the Earth's surface like the layers of a cake. He had read a battered copy of Alexander von Humboldt's Cosmos that the schoolteacher had given him when he was 14, telling him that a mind like his should not be wasted on rocks and cattle. Nathaniel Mercer had regarded this habit with a mixture of bewilderment and mild contempt, the way a blacksmith might regard a son who preferred to sketch flowers rather than shoe horses. Nathaniel believed in land and timber and livestock, in things a man could see and touch and sell. He could not see the value in a boy who sat on the porch and read about the composition of limestone when there was hay to be cut and fences to be mended. "You will never make a living from books," he had said more than once, and Caleb had not argued because arguing with his father was like arguing with the weather, pointless and exhausting. Caleb arrived at his inheritance on March 29, 1873, with a wagon carrying his surveying tools, his books wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry, a cast iron stove that he had bought used from a widow in Cheyenne, and enough provisions to last 3 months if he was careful. The land was exactly as forbidding as the lawyer's description had suggested, and perhaps more so. Redstone Creek, which gave the area its name, was little more than a dry gulch for 8 months of the year, running with water only during spring melt and after the rare summer thunderstorm. The hillside rose at an angle that made a man lean forward when he climbed it, covered with sparse pine and scrub oak and patches of sagebrush that released their sharp smell when the sun warmed them. The rock faces were pale gray limestone, cracked and fissured, streaked with iron stains the color of dried blood. Caleb had read enough geology to know that limestone was sedimentary rock, formed from the compressed shells of ancient sea creatures that had lived here when Wyoming was covered by a warm, shallow ocean millions of years before there were men to give it a name. The knowledge did not make the land any less forbidding, but it gave him a framework for understanding what he was looking at, and understanding was the first step toward finding value in what others dismissed as worthless. He spent 3 weeks walking every acre of his property, carrying a surveyor's compass and a measuring chain, making notes in a leather-bound journal that his mother had given him before she died. The work was slow and methodical. He mapped the slope of the land, the patterns of drainage, the types of vegetation that grew in different areas. He noted the places where limestone outcroppings broke through the thin soil, and the places where wind had carved the rock into strange shapes that looked like faces or animals if a man had enough imagination and enough solitude to see them. On the 21st day of his survey, he found the cave. It was not a dramatic discovery. There was no shaft of golden light, no sudden revelation. He had been working his way along the base of a cliff band, noting the angle of the strata, when he saw a narrow cleft partially hidden behind a rockfall that looked recent, perhaps from the previous winter's freeze and thaw. The opening was small, maybe 18 inches wide, and dark in a way that suggested depth rather than shadow. Caleb spent 2 days clearing the rockfall, moving stones that ranged from the size of a man's fist to boulders that required a pry bar and patience to shift. His hands were bleeding by the time he finished, and his shoulders ached in a way that made him think of his father saying that book learning never built character the way hard work did. When the entrance was clear, he lit a lantern and squeezed through the gap into darkness that smelled of damp stone and deep time. The passage sloped downward for perhaps 40 feet, narrow enough that Caleb had to turn sideways in places, the rock walls close enough to touch on both sides. The limestone was cool under his hands, smooth in some places where water had polished it over countless centuries, rough in others where crystals had formed and caught the lantern light like tiny mirrors. He could hear water somewhere, not flowing but dripping, the sound echoing in a way that suggested space ahead, emptiness waiting to be filled with light and understanding. Then the passage opened suddenly into a chamber that made him stop and hold the lantern higher to see the full extent of it. The room was perhaps 25 feet across and 10 feet high, with a floor of packed earth that was dry and level, covered with a fine layer of silt, so undisturbed that his footprints were the first marks it had known in years or perhaps decades. The ceiling was smooth limestone, carved by water over millennia into gentle curves that caught the lantern light and reflected it back in shades of cream and amber. Along the walls, he could see the layers of rock, horizontal bands that marked different periods of deposition, different ages of the ancient sea that had once covered this land. The air had a smell that Caleb would remember for the rest of his life, a combination of damp stone and deep time, mineral and clean, utterly unlike the smell of living spaces where people cooked food and burned wood and left the marks of their presence in smoke and grease and sweat. This was the smell of the earth itself, patient and permanent, indifferent to the brief flicker of human life on its surface. What struck Caleb, what stopped him in his tracks and made him stand perfectly still with the lantern held at arm's length, was the temperature. Outside, on that April morning, the air had been cold enough to make his breath visible, perhaps 48 degrees. Inside the cave, the air was warmer. Not hot, not even what most men would call warm, but noticeably milder than the wind that had been blowing across the hillside all morning. He set the lantern down carefully on a rock ledge and pulled a small thermometer from his coat pocket, the kind with a mercury bulb that his father had thought was a foolish expense when Caleb bought it from a catalog 2 years before. He hung the thermometer from a crack in the rock and waited. Patience was something Caleb had learned early, born from being the youngest and least valued son, from knowing that rushing got a man nowhere when the world had already decided his place in it. He waited 2 hours, sitting on the cave floor with his back against the wall, watching the mercury settle and stabilize. When he finally stood and held the lantern close to read the measurement, the thermometer showed 56 degrees Fahrenheit. 56 degrees in a cave in April when the outside air was hovering around freezing. Caleb had read about this in the geological surveys, in the agricultural journals that discussed European methods of food storage. Caves maintained a nearly constant temperature year-round, typically close to the average annual temperature of the region. The enormous mass of rock surrounding the chamber acted like a battery, storing heat in summer and releasing it in winter, creating an environment that barely changed no matter what the weather did on the surface. In eastern Wyoming, where the average annual temperature was somewhere around 42 degrees, a deep cave might hold steady at 55 or 56 degrees, give or take a few degrees depending on depth and ventilation. He sat there for a long time after taking that first reading, thinking about what it meant. 56 degrees was too cold for a man to live comfortably without a fire, but it was perfect for storing vegetables. The agricultural journals he had read, the ones that discussed the methods used by European farmers to keep potatoes and turnips through winter, all recommended storage temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees, with humidity below 80% to prevent mold and rot. He pulled out the hygrometer he had brought, another instrument his father had mocked, and measured the humidity at 68%. Not perfect, but close enough to work with, close enough to build on. That night Caleb slept inside the cave on a canvas bedroll, and woke to silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. The lantern had burned down to a faint glow. The darkness around him was absolute and ancient, the kind of darkness that had existed before men invented fire and would exist long after the last fire went out. He was alone in a way he had never been. No brother's voice, no father's disapproval, no town watching and judging. Just stone and silence and the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the passage. He lay there for a long time and felt something he had not expected. Not fear, not loneliness. Relief. Over the following weeks, Caleb explored the cave system with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. The main chamber connected to 4 smaller rooms through passages that ranged from tight crawls to openings wide enough to walk through upright. He mapped every passage with his compass and measuring chain, recording distances and ceiling heights in his journal. He noted the temperature in each chamber with the mercury thermometer, checking it at different times of day to see if it varied. The readings were remarkably consistent. 57 degrees in the chamber nearest the entrance, where outside air mixed with cave air. 55 degrees in the middle chambers. 53 degrees in the deepest room, where the rock was thickest and the outside world felt very far away. The variation across the weeks he spent exploring was no more than 2 degrees, and Caleb suspected that even across seasons the temperature would remain stable, held constant by the millions of tons of limestone that surrounded these chambers like insulation thicker than any wall a man could build. The cave breathed. He noticed this on still days when the wind was calm outside. In the morning, air flowed gently outward from the entrance, carrying the coolness of the deep chambers into the warming day. In the evening, the flow reversed, drawing cooler outside air inward as the surface temperature dropped. This was convection, the same principle that made hot air rise and cold air sink, creating a slow, constant circulation that meant the air inside was never stale, never damp enough to breed the mold that ruined stored food. By May, Caleb had begun to build. He established his living quarters in the main chamber, close enough to the entrance to get fresh air and daylight, far enough in to stay out of the wind. He set up the cast iron stove near the entrance where the natural draft would carry smoke outward, and built a sleeping platform from pine logs he cut on the upper slopes where a few trees grew thick enough to be useful. He built a writing desk from flat stones stacked and topped with a planed board, and hung his lanterns from iron hooks driven into cracks in the ceiling. Within a month, he had something that was not quite a home, but was considerably more comfortable than the tent he had been sleeping in, and certainly more interesting than any bunkhouse or boarding room he could have rented in town. The people of Redstone Creek, such as they were, perhaps 40 families scattered across the surrounding hills and valleys, regarded Caleb with a mixture of curiosity and pity. A man living in a cave was not unheard of in Wyoming territory, but it generally indicated either extreme poverty or a deficiency of mind. Caleb appeared to be neither poor nor simple, which made him harder to categorize and therefore more unsettling. He came to town once every 2 weeks for supplies, paid cash for what he bought, and answered questions with the minimum number of words necessary. When Vernon Tucker asked what exactly he was doing up there in those hills, Caleb said, living, and did not elaborate. When Earl Hoskins asked if he planned to ranch or farm, Caleb said neither, and changed the subject by asking about the price of lamp oil. By June, Caleb had begun his real work. The middle chambers, accessed through a passage roughly 60 feet from the main entrance, maintained not only stable temperature but remarkably low humidity. The limestone walls absorbed moisture from the air and held it in their porous structure, releasing it slowly enough that the overall humidity stayed between 65 and 70%. These conditions, Caleb knew from his reading, were nearly identical to those recommended by agricultural scientists for the long-term storage of root vegetables. The journals he had studied described the elaborate measures European farmers took to maintain temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees with humidity below 80%, building underground cellars lined with straw and stone, monitoring conditions constantly through the growing season and into winter. Nature had built him a cellar that surpassed anything human engineering could achieve, carved by water and time from rock that was 450 million years old, regulated by thermal mass so enormous that the changing seasons barely touched it. All he had to do was recognize what he had and use it properly. He spent the summer preparing, working alone in the chambers with a patience that would have surprised anyone who thought cave living was the choice of a desperate man. He cleared and leveled the floors of 3 adjoining chambers, each roughly 15 feet square, removing loose rock and smoothing the packed earth until it was level enough to build on. The work required a pickaxe for the harder sections and a shovel for the rest, and his hands developed new calluses on top of the old ones, thick pads of skin that marked him as a man who worked even if the work he did made no sense to anyone watching. He built wooden shelving along the walls, simple sturdy frames of oak that he cut from trees growing in a draw 3 miles north, trees that were straight enough to split into planks with wedges and patience. The shelving was fitted together with mortise and tenon joints that required no nails, each joint carved by hand with a chisel he kept sharp enough to shave with. Each piece fitted so precisely that the frame held together by friction and geometry, rather than by metal fasteners that would rust in the cave's humidity. He raised the frame 6 inches off the floor on stone footings that he carved from limestone blocks, setting them level with the care of a man building something meant to last beyond his lifetime. He fashioned ventilation channels by widening existing cracks in the rock, with a hammer and chisel, patient work that took weeks and left his hands blistered, and his shoulders aching in ways that made sleep difficult. Each crack had to be expanded carefully to avoid weakening the surrounding rock, widened just enough to allow air to flow without creating a draft strong enough to disturb the temperature stability. The work was slow and tedious and absolutely necessary, creating pathways that connected to the cave's natural airflow, enhancing the convection that already existed, turning a good system into an optimal one. He lined each shelf with a layer of clean straw, then a layer of dry sand, creating a bed that would cushion stored vegetables and absorb excess moisture without promoting rot. The work was slow and solitary and satisfying in a way that Caleb could not have explained to anyone, least of all to his brothers who thought satisfaction came from owning cattle or selling timber. He was building something that worked with nature rather than against it, using principles that were older than human civilization, tested by time in a way that no modern method could claim. In August and September he began to buy. He did not buy from one farmer but from every grower within a 30-mile radius, visiting farms and ranches scattered across the territory like seeds scattered by an uneven hand. He traveled to the Heartland place where 4 children watched from behind their mother's skirts while their father sold 200 pounds of small potatoes that would never bring market price. He traveled to the Brecht farm where Samuel's wife served him coffee, while Samuel counted silver coins twice to make sure he was not being cheated by the strange young man who lived in a cave. He traveled to the Morrison widow's place where she sold him 100 pounds and asked no questions because A woman alone with 3 children could not afford to turn down cash no matter how odd the buyer seemed. He paid 2 cents a pound for produce that most men would have fed to pigs or left in the field to rot, potatoes that were too small or too oddly shaped to sell at market, the ones with minor cuts or bruises that would have turned to mush in a traditional cellar, but might survive in the stable environment he had created. He paid in silver coins that rang when they hit the table, a sound that meant more than words in a place where cash was scarce and credit was the usual currency of transaction. The coins made farmers willing to sell even when they thought the buyer might be touched in the head, because silver was silver, and it spent the same whether the buyer was sane or not. "What do you need all these potatoes for?" Thomas Hartley asked when Caleb arrived at his farm with an empty wagon and an offer to buy everything Hartley did not plan to keep for his own family. "Personal use," Caleb said, and did not elaborate. Hartley, who was 42 and had 4 children and a wife who was expecting a fifth, looked at the wagon and then at Caleb and said, "That is enough potatoes to feed 20 families through winter." Caleb said, "I like potatoes," and waited while Hartley decided whether to sell or to ask more questions. Hartley sold, because cash was cash and a man did not turn down money just because the buyer seemed odd. By the first week of October, Caleb had stored approximately 2,800 pounds of potatoes in his cave chambers, spread across the shelved rooms in layers no more than 3 deep, each layer separated by straw and sand to prevent bruising and allow air circulation. He had also stored 600 pounds of carrots, turnips, and onions, each type in its own section, each carefully monitored with thermometers and hygrometers that he checked twice daily, and recorded in his journal with the precision of a scientist, conducting an experiment that might fail but was worth attempting anyway. This was when the laughter began. The farmers who had sold him their surplus talked, as farmers do, and word spread through Redstone Creek and the surrounding valleys like smoke through a crack in a chimney, carried by wives who met at church socials and men who gathered at the feed store on Saturday afternoons when the week's work was done. The caveman, they called him at first, which was merely descriptive and carried no particular judgment. Then cave hermit, which suggested eccentricity but stopped short of condemnation. Then, as the full scope of his potato purchasing became known, and the stories grew with each retelling, cave fool, which suggested something darker and more permanent, a man so disconnected from normal life that he did not realize how ridiculous he appeared to others. 2,800 pounds of potatoes, enough to feed a regiment through a siege. The man who lived like a hermit was now hoarding food like a squirrel preparing for a winter that would never end, or like a madman who thought the end of the world was coming, and only he had the wisdom to prepare. The whole enterprise struck people as the funniest thing they had heard in months, funnier than the time Jacob Miller's wagon lost a wheel and dumped a load of fence posts into Redstone Creek. Funnier than the traveling salesman who tried to sell earthquake insurance to people who had never felt an earthquake and never would. It became a joke that men told to make their wives laugh, a story that spread to neighboring valleys and took on details that were more fiction than fact, but served the purpose of entertainment regardless of accuracy. Children shouted "Cave Fool" from a safe distance when Caleb came to town. Women whispered it behind their hands at church socials. Men said it to his face with grins that dared him to take offense, to prove that he was not only foolish but also thin-skinned, unable to take a joke. Caleb did not take offense. He bought his salt and his lamp oil and his cheesecloth, and he went back to his cave and he waited. He waited through October as the aspen turned gold on the hillsides and the first frost killed the last of the summer flowers. He waited as the temperature dropped and the days grew shorter and the ranchers brought their cattle down from the high pastures to winter closer to the barns where hay was stored. He checked his chambers daily, recording temperatures that varied by less than a degree from week to week. 57 in the upper chamber, 55 in the middle, 53 in the deep. The potatoes sat on their shelves in perfect condition, firm and dry, showing no signs of sprouting or rot. On October 19th, he stood in the doorway of Tucker's Mercantile and listened to men laugh. He did not defend himself because defense would have required explanation, and explanation would have required them to understand principles they had never studied and had no interest in learning. Words were just sounds. They could not hurt him unless he let them, and he had spent too many years listening to his father's disappointment to be wounded by the mockery of men who thought 4 feet of dirt was enough to protect vegetables from a Wyoming winter. That evening back at the cave, Caleb made his daily rounds of the chambers. He checked each thermometer, each hygrometer, running his hand over the stored vegetables to feel for soft spots or unusual warmth that might indicate the beginning of rot. Everything was perfect. The system was working exactly as theory predicted it would. He opened his journal to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top in his careful script. October 19th, 1873. Main chamber 56 degrees Fahrenheit, he wrote. Middle chamber 55 degrees. Deep chamber 53 degrees. Total stored 2,800 pounds potatoes, 600 pounds other vegetables. Total investment to date $703 including land improvements and stored produce. Town calls me cave fool. Let them. He closed the journal and sat for a while on the edge of his sleeping platform, looking out through the cave entrance at the darkening sky. The first stars were appearing, bright and cold in the thin air of altitude. Somewhere down in the valley, Vernon Tucker was probably closing his store, counting the day's receipts, maybe telling his wife about the cave fool and his ridiculous potatoes. Somewhere beyond that, Jackson was probably sitting in the ranch house their father had built, comfortable and confident in the inheritance he had received. Robert was probably in the sawmill office, doing whatever Robert did in the evenings before going home to a leaner, and whatever comforts or discomforts waited there. Caleb felt no envy. He had stopped envying his brothers years ago, around the time he realized that owning things and understanding things were not the same, and that he would rather understand the world than own a piece of it. He got up and banked the stove for the night, adding just enough wood to keep a small fire burning until morning. The cave did not need heat, but he liked having a little light and warmth near the entrance where he slept, a concession to comfort that geology did not require but humanity did. On October 28th, 9 days after his visit to town, the first snow fell. Not the light decorative dusting common to Wyoming autumns, but a serious storm that dropped 8 inches in 12 hours and gave every indication of being a preview of what was coming. Caleb woke to silence that was different from the usual silence, the muffled quiet that comes when snow covers everything and absorbs sound. He dressed and walked to the cave entrance and looked out at a world transformed into white and gray, the familiar landscape made strange by the soft curves of snow drifts and the way the sage brush had become formless mounds. He checked the outside temperature with a thermometer he kept hanging just inside the entrance, protected from wind but exposed to outside air. 34 degrees. Then he walked deeper into the cave and checked the main chamber thermometer, 56 degrees, unchanged. Outside, winter was beginning its siege. Inside, the mountain held its ancient warmth, indifferent to weather, regulated by thermal mass so vast that the changing seasons were merely surface disturbances, temporary and insignificant. Caleb stood in the main chamber for a long time that morning, listening to the silence and thinking about the weeks to come. He thought about the farmers whose root cellars were 4 feet deep, built according to tradition and conventional wisdom, adequate for normal winters but untested against the kind of cold that came through every decade or so and caught everyone by surprise. He thought about his brothers, about Jackson's bottomland ranch with its traditional cellar, about Robert's sawmill and whatever provisions he and Eleanor had laid up for winter. He thought about the 2,800 pounds of potatoes sitting on shelves in chambers that would stay 55 degrees, whether the temperature outside dropped to 0 or 20 below. He was not hoping for disaster. That would have been unworthy, but he was prepared for it, and preparation was its own kind of power, quiet and unassuming and easily mistaken for foolishness until the moment when it proved to be wisdom instead. He opened his journal and made his daily entry. October 28, 1873, he wrote, "First significant snow, 8 inches. Outside temperature 34 degrees. Cave main chamber 56 degrees, middle chamber 55 degrees, deep chamber 53 degrees. All stored produce in excellent condition. System performing exactly as predicted." He closed the journal and went about his day. There was wood to split for the stove, water to carry from the spring that ran year-round a quarter-mile down the slope, a crack in one of the ventilation channels that needed sealing with clay. The work of living, simple and necessary, the kind of work that filled days and gave them structure. He did not think about the town or about the men who had laughed. He thought about temperature and humidity, and the geometry of shelf spacing, and the way limestone absorbed moisture at a rate that could be calculated if a man had the right instruments and the patience to take measurements over time. 3 miles down the valley, in the ranch house that had been built by their father and his father before him, Jackson Mercer stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the falling snow with the satisfaction of a man who has done what needs doing and can rest in the certainty that preparation is complete. His root cellar was finished, built in September by 2 ranch hands who knew the traditional method because they had learned it from their fathers who had learned it from theirs. Knowledge passed down through generations like the knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest. The cellar was 4 feet deep, exactly as tradition specified, lined with straw for insulation, and covered with a mound of earth that would, in theory, protect the stored vegetables from the worst of the winter cold. The theory was sound. It had worked for 40 years in his father's time, and for decades before that in his grandfather's time. 4 feet of earth was sufficient to keep frost from reaching the stored food during normal winters, and there was no reason to think this winter would be anything other than normal. The cellar held 800 pounds of potatoes and turnips, enough to supplement the beef and canned goods that would feed his family and his hands through the cold months. Jackson was not worried. The method had been tested by time and found reliable. There was no need to change what worked, no need to experiment with untested ideas or to waste money on thermometers and other foolish instruments that his youngest brother seemed to think were necessary. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table that had been their mother's, polished smooth by decades of use, and thought briefly about Caleb living in a cave like some kind of wild animal, storing potatoes in quantities that made no sense for a single man with no family and no prospects for acquiring either. He felt a mix of pity and contempt that was not quite strong enough to be called either emotion, but lingered somewhere between them. A vague unease that Caleb's oddness reflected poorly on the family, on the Mercer name that Jackson now carried as the eldest son and head of the family such as it was. Their father had been embarrassed by Caleb's book reading and his strange interests. Jackson felt that embarrassment now, magnified by the knowledge that people in town were laughing about his brother, and by extension about the whole Mercer family. But there was nothing to be done about it. A man could not change his brother any more than he could change the weather. Jackson finished his coffee and went to check on the cattle and to make sure the hay supply would last until spring. He had his own concerns, his own responsibilities, and they did not include worrying about a fool who stored potatoes in a cave. The snow fell all day and into the night, and by morning there were 10 more inches on top of the 8 from the day before. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Cold but not unusual. Winter in Wyoming territory, the same as it had been for as long as anyone could remember. Out in the hills above Redstone Creek, Caleb Mercer checked his thermometers and recorded his readings and went about the work of living in a cave that most people thought was a sign of madness or poverty or both. The cave stayed 56 degrees. The potatoes stayed firm and dry. The mountain, ancient and patient, kept its counsel and waited for winter to show what it would show. November was 2 days away. November arrived with cold that settled into the bones and stayed there. The snow that had fallen on October 28th melted within 3 days, leaving the ground muddy and the sky the color of old pewter. Caleb Mercer checked his thermometers twice daily as he had done since spring, recording the readings in his journal with the same careful precision he brought to everything. The outside temperature fluctuated between 38 degrees at midday and 24 degrees before dawn. Inside the cave, the main chamber held steady at 56 degrees, the middle chamber at 55, the deep chamber at 53. The variation was less than 1 degree from the readings he had taken in September, less than 2 degrees from the readings he had taken in June. The mountain, as he had begun to think of the vast mass of limestone that surrounded his chambers, did not notice the changing seasons. 3 miles down the valley, Jackson Mercer stood in the yard of his ranch watching 2 hired men dig the pit that would become his root cellar. The location was traditional, on the north side of the barn where the earth stayed coolest in summer and where snow drifted deepest in winter to provide additional insulation. The men, ranch hands named Charlie Webb and Samuel Ortiz, knew the work without being told because they had done it before on other ranches, following a method that was as old as settlement in this territory and probably older than that, carried west by men who had learned it from their fathers in states where winter was a certainty and preparation was survival. The pit was 8 feet long and 10 feet wide, exactly the dimensions that experience had proven optimal for a family of moderate size. The depth was 4 feet, measured carefully with a stick marked in 6-inch increments, deep enough to reach below the frost line in a normal winter, shallow enough to be excavated in a reasonable amount of time by 2 men with shovels and a willingness to work. Charlie and Samuel dug through soil that was already beginning to freeze, the top 6 inches hard enough to require a pickaxe, the deeper earth still soft enough to turn with a spade. They worked steadily through the morning and into the afternoon, their breath visible in the cold air, their backs bent to the rhythm of the work that all men knew who made their living from the land. Jackson watched them work with the satisfaction of a man who has done what needs doing. The cellar would be lined with split logs to prevent cave-in, the floor covered with a layer of gravel for drainage, the walls banked with straw for insulation. The vegetables would be stored in wooden bins raised off the floor, separated by type to prevent the spread of rot should any piece begin to spoil. A mound of earth would cover the whole structure, thick enough to shed rain and hold in the stable temperature that 4 feet of depth provided. The method had been tested by generations of use. His father had built cellars this way, his grandfather before him. The design worked because it was based on observation and experience, the accumulated knowledge of men who understood their land and their climate. By evening of the second day, the pit was complete, and the men began the work of construction. They set logs vertically around the perimeter, bracing them with crosspieces driven into the earth, creating walls that would hold back the soil and provide structure for the roof. They built bins from rough lumber, simple boxes with slatted sides to allow air circulation. They lined the floor with gravel hauled from the creek bed, and the walls with straw purchased from a farmer whose hay harvest had been more generous than his livestock needed. By the 4th day, The cellar was ready for stocking. Jackson stood at the entrance, which was a slanted wooden door set into the earthen mound like the entrance to a storm shelter, and looked at the bins that would hold his family's food through winter. 800 pounds of potatoes, he calculated, plus turnips and carrots and onions, enough to supplement the beef they would slaughter in December, and the canned goods his wife had put up in summer. The cellar was a good piece of work, solid and traditional and adequate for what it needed to do. He paid Charlie and Samuel their wages, $3 each for 4 days of labor, and felt the quiet pride that comes from having prepared properly for what was coming. That same week, Caleb Mercer worked alone in his cave chambers, making refinements to a system that was already functioning but could, he believed, function better. He had noticed that the potatoes on the upper shelves, closest to the ceiling, showed slightly more tendency toward sprouting than those on the lower shelves, a difference so small that most men would not have seen it, but which Caleb's careful observations had revealed. The temperature gradient was minimal, perhaps half a degree warmer near the ceiling where warm air rose and collected before being drawn away by the cave's natural ventilation. But even that small difference was enough to trigger the biological processes that led to sprouting. He spent 2 days rearranging the storage pattern, moving the potatoes that showed the earliest signs of sprouting to the lower shelves, where the temperature was most stable, replacing them with vegetables that were less sensitive to minor temperature variations. The work was tedious and required handling each bin individually, checking each potato for firmness and the presence of sprouts, making decisions based on observations that were measured in fractions of degrees and increments so small that they could barely be quantified. It was the kind of work that would have driven most men to distraction, but Caleb found it satisfying in the way that all precise work is satisfying, when a man understands the principles behind what he is doing. On the 8th of November, Caleb noticed something wrong. The deep chamber, which had maintained a steady 53 degrees since he began taking measurements in April, was reading 51 degrees. He checked the thermometer twice to make sure it was not a measurement error, holding his lantern close to see the mercury line, waiting to see if it would rise. It did not. 51 degrees, 2 degrees cooler than it should be. The change was not dramatic, but it was significant because it suggested that his understanding of the cave's thermal properties was incomplete, that there was something he had missed in his months of observation and measurement. He spent the rest of that day and all of the next investigating the anomaly, methodically checking every aspect of the deep chamber that might explain the temperature drop. The ventilation channels were clear, showing no signs of blockage. The humidity was unchanged at 68%. The barometric pressure, which he measured with a small aneroid barometer he had bought from a catalog, was steady. There was no obvious cause for the change, which meant the cause was not obvious and would require more thorough investigation than a simple visual inspection could provide. On the afternoon of the second day, Caleb noticed what he had missed before because he had not been looking for it. At the back of the deep chamber, where the rock wall met the floor, there was a crack that he had assumed was merely a surface fissure, the kind of minor imperfection that limestone develops over geological time. He held his candle near the crack and felt a draft of air that was cooler than the chamber's ambient temperature. Not a strong draft, barely perceptible but present and persistent. He set the candle down and examined the crack more carefully, running his fingers along the edges, feeling the way it widened as it descended into the rock. The crack was not a surface fissure. It was an opening, narrow and partially obscured by fallen rock, but an opening nonetheless. Caleb began to clear the debris, moving stones that ranged from small fragments to pieces the size of his head, working carefully to avoid causing a collapse that would seal the opening permanently. The work took 4 hours and left his hands cut and his back aching, but by evening, He had cleared enough rock to see that the crack opened into a passage that sloped downward into darkness that his lantern could not penetrate. He did not explore that evening. The sun was setting, and he had learned long ago that cave exploration in failing light was a good way to get lost or injured or both. Instead, he marked the opening with a cairn of stones so he could find it easily the next day, and he went back to his sleeping quarters to eat a cold supper and make notes in his journal. Deep chamber temperature anomaly investigated. He wrote, source identified as previously unnoticed passage at rear of chamber. Air flow from passage accounts for 2-degree temperature drop. Passage appears to descend to lower level. We'll explore tomorrow with adequate rope and light. He slept poorly that night, his mind turning over the possibilities of what might lie below. His reading of geological surveys had taught him that cave systems often existed in multiple levels, created by the same water that carved the upper chambers, continuing its work at greater depths as the water table dropped over millennia. A lower level would mean cooler temperatures, possibly as low as 48 or 50 degrees, cold enough to store apples and dairy products that required conditions even more stable than what the upper chambers provided. The economic implications were significant, but what excited Caleb more than the prospect of profit was the simple fact of discovery, the knowledge that his land held more than he had initially understood. The next morning he prepared for the descent with the thoroughness that characterized everything he did. He gathered 100 feet of hemp rope that he had bought for hauling supplies, testing each section for weakness or fraying. He filled 2 lanterns with oil and checked their wicks. He packed a small knapsack with candles, matches wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry, a compass, a ball of twine for marking his path, and his thermometer. He told no one where he was going because there was no one to tell, a solitude that was both freedom and risk in equal measure. The passage was tight enough that he had to remove his coat and push it ahead of him, tight enough that his shoulders scraped the walls on both sides, and he had to control his breathing to avoid the panic that came from enclosed spaces. The rock was cold against his hands and smelled of minerals and ancient water. He descended slowly, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it, paying out rope behind him and tying it off at intervals to metal stakes he had hammered into cracks in the rock. The passage twisted and turned, angling downward at a slope that was steep enough to be treacherous but not so steep that he needed to rappel. After 30 feet, the passage widened slightly and he could see, in the lantern light that seemed pitifully small against the enormous darkness, that he was entering a chamber. He emerged from the passage into a space that was larger than the main chamber above, perhaps 30 feet across and 15 feet high, with a ceiling that was studded with formations that caught the light and threw it back in points of white and amber. The floor was level and dry, covered with the same fine silt that covered the floors of the upper chambers. The air was noticeably cooler than the deep chamber above, cool enough that his breath was visible in the lantern light. He set the lantern down and pulled out his thermometer, hanging it from a rock projection and forcing himself to wait the required time for an accurate reading. The waiting was hard when every instinct wanted to explore, to see what else this lower level held, but accurate measurement required patience, and Caleb had learned patience in a hard school. After 20 minutes he checked the thermometer and felt a surge of satisfaction that was almost physical. 48 degrees. Exactly what he had hoped for, exactly what the geological principles suggested should exist at this depth. He spent the next 3 hours exploring and mapping the lower level. The main chamber connected to 3 smaller rooms, each separated by passages that were easier to navigate than the initial descent. One room held a natural spring that trickled from a crack in the wall and disappeared into a fissure in the floor, creating humidity that was higher than the upper chambers but still within acceptable range for certain types of storage. Another room was smaller and drier, with a temperature that measured 46 degrees, the coolest space he had found yet. The third room was larger and showed evidence of past water flow. Smooth channels carved into the floor that suggested this level had once held an underground stream that had since found a deeper path. He marked each room on the rough map he drew in his journal, noting dimensions and temperatures and humidity readings, building a mental picture of how this lower level related to the upper chambers and how both related to the surface above. The system was more complex than he had initially realized, more useful and more valuable. The upper chambers at 55 to 57 degrees were perfect for potatoes and root vegetables. The middle chamber at 53 degrees was ideal for onions and turnips that preferred slightly cooler conditions. These new lower chambers at 46 to 48 degrees would store apples and pears, butter and hard cheese, anything that benefited from temperatures close to, but not below freezing. He was about to begin the ascent when he heard a sound that stopped him cold. A crack, sharp and sudden, like a pistol shot in the enclosed space. Then a rumble that seemed to come from the rock itself. Then silence. He grabbed the lantern and started for the passage that led back to the upper level, moving faster than was safe, knowing that a cave-in could trap him here as effectively as a locked door. He reached the bottom of the passage and looked up to see that the rope he had tied off was hanging loose, the end frayed where it had broken under some stress he had not anticipated. 3 hours later, hands bleeding and shoulders aching from pulling himself up through the passage without the security of a rope, Caleb emerged into the deep chamber and sat on the floor until his breathing returned to normal and his hands stopped shaking. The rope had broken at a point where it had been rubbing against a sharp edge of rock, a weakness he had not noticed when he tied it off because he had been too eager to explore and not careful enough in his preparation. The mistake could have killed him. If the passage had been vertical instead of sloped, if there had been another collapse that blocked his exit, if he had exhausted his lantern oil before finding a way up, he would have died in the darkness below, and no one would have known where to look for his body. He sat there until dark thinking about mortality and preparation, and the difference between acceptable risk and foolish chance. Then he went to his sleeping quarters and cleaned his hands and made his journal entry. Lower level discovered and mapped, he wrote. 4 chambers ranging from 46 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit, suitable for apple and dairy storage. Rope failed during descent, self-rescue required. Shoulder injured but functional. Will install permanent ladder and safety anchors before returning to lower level. Note to self, enthusiasm is not a substitute for caution. The next week he worked on making the lower level accessible and safe. He built a wooden ladder from oak planks, sturdy and wide enough to descend without fear of the rungs breaking. He installed iron anchors at intervals along the passage, driven deep into solid rock, and tested with his full weight before he trusted them with a rope. He created a pulley system that would allow him to raise and lower supplies without having to carry them on his back. The work was slow and methodical and absolutely necessary, the kind of preparation that prevented accidents rather than recovering from them. By November 15th, the lower level was ready for use, but Caleb told no one about it. The discovery was a competitive advantage, a feature of his land that made it more valuable than anyone, including himself, had initially understood. If he began storing dairy products and apples, if he offered services that no one else could match, there would be time enough for people to ask questions and for him to decide how much to reveal. For now, the lower level was his secret, known only to him and recorded only in his journal that no one else would read. That same day, he went to town for supplies and took the opportunity to mention, as casually as he could manage, that the signs suggested a harder winter than usual. He stood at the counter in Tucker's Mercantile while Vernon tallied his purchases and said, "I expect it will be cold this year." Vernon looked up from his ledger and said, "What makes you say that? The elk are migrating lower than I have seen them in 5 years, Caleb said. The pine jays are caching more seeds than usual. The woolly bear caterpillars have thick black bands. Vernon smiled the way a man smiles at a child who has said something charming but foolish and said, "You read that in one of your books." "I observed it," Caleb said. "Same way I observed the barometric pressure has been low and steady for a week, which usually precedes a major storm system." Vernon finished his tallying and said, "That will be $3.40. You might want to add extra lamp oil," Caleb said. "And anyone with a root cellar might want to consider going deeper than usual this year." Vernon took Caleb's money and made change and said, "I appreciate the concern, but I think folks around here know how to prepare for winter without reading it in a book." Caleb took his change and his supplies and left without argument. Words were just sounds, and Vernon Tucker was not a man who learned from words anyway. That afternoon Caleb rode out to his brother's ranch, taking a route that followed the creek bed, and then climbed through a stand of aspen that were bare now, their white bark stark against the gray sky. He found Jackson in the barn checking harness leather, preparing for the work of winter feeding when cattle would need hay hauled from the stack to the feeding grounds. They had not spoken since the reading of the will 8 months before, but Jackson greeted him civilly enough and offered coffee that Caleb accepted, because refusing would have been rude. They sat on a bench outside the barn drinking coffee that was strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, and Caleb said what he had come to say. "I think it will be a hard winter." Jackson looked at him and said, "What makes you think so?" "The signs," Caleb said. "Wildlife behavior, atmospheric pressure, the way the clouds have been forming." Jackson was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your cellar might want to go deeper than 4 feet this year." Jackson sipped his coffee and said, "Little brother, I have been ranching 15 years. 4 feet has always been plenty." "It might not be this year," Caleb said. Jackson set his cup down and put his hand on Caleb's shoulder the way he had in the lawyer's office, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring but felt condescending instead. "I appreciate the concern," he said, "but I think I know my business." Caleb started to say more and then stopped because he could see in Jackson's eyes that more words would accomplish nothing. His brother had the confidence that comes from success and experience, the certainty that the methods he knew were adequate for whatever came. There was no way to convince a man like that to change based on woolly bear caterpillars and barometric pressure readings. Caleb finished his coffee and rode back to his cave thinking about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between understanding principles and trusting tradition. Both had value. Both were necessary. But when principles and tradition disagreed, a man had to choose which voice to listen to, and the choice revealed something essential about who that man was. The weather turned colder. On November 22nd, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees and a light snow fell, not the heavy accumulation of late October, but a steady fall that added 8 inches to the ground and gave every indication that winter had arrived in earnest. Caleb checked his chambers and found them unchanged. 56 degrees in the main chamber, 55 in the middle, 53 in the deep, 48 in the lower level that no one but him knew existed. The vegetables he had stored showed no signs of stress, no sprouting, no soft spots, no indication that the changing conditions outside had penetrated the limestone barrier that surrounded them. In town and on ranches scattered across the territory, men looked at their root cellars and felt satisfied with their preparations. The cellars were traditional, built according to methods that had been proven over generations, adequate for normal winters and probably adequate for this one despite the cold. There was no reason for concern. Winter always came. Winter always passed. The cycle was as old as settlement and as reliable as the seasons themselves. On November 25th, the temperature plunged again, dropping from 18 degrees to 5 degrees in a single afternoon. There was no snow, just brutal cold that made metal brittle and wood crack and breath freeze in beards and mustaches. Livestock needed extra feed, and animals that were not sheltered needed to be brought in or risk freezing. Some of the root cellars showed frost on their uppermost layers, the potatoes and turnips closest to the surface developing a thin skin of ice that would, in a normal cold snap, melt within days and cause no permanent damage. Then, on November 28th, the great blizzard came. Caleb saw it approaching from the cave entrance in the early morning, a wall of gray cloud that stretched across the northern horizon like a curtain being drawn across the sky. The light changed first, going from the clear cold brightness of a winter morning to a diffuse yellow glow that made everything look jaundiced and sick. Then the wind arrived, not gradually but all at once, as though someone had opened a door to some vast frozen room where wind was born. The sound was what men would remember afterward, those who survived to tell about it. A low roar like a freight train heard from a distance, growing louder as the storm approached, building from a whisper to a moan to a shriek that hurt the ears and made speech impossible. The wind picked up from 20 miles per hour to 35 to 50 in the space of 2 hours, driving before it a snow so thick and fine that it penetrated every crack and crevice, found its way through closed doors and shuttered windows, accumulated in places that should have been sheltered. By 2 in the afternoon, visibility had dropped to nothing. A man standing at arm's length disappeared into the white chaos. The world contracted to whatever a man could touch with his hands, and anything beyond that was gone, erased, as though it had never existed. By evening, the wind was strong enough to tear shingles from roofs and overturn wagons that had not been properly secured. Trees that had stood for decades went down with cracks that sounded like rifle shots. The temperature dropped from 18 degrees to 0 to -10 and kept dropping. The storm lasted 3 days, 72 hours of wind that never dropped below 40 miles per hour and sometimes gusted to 70. Snow that fell steadily and relentlessly, piling up in drifts that reached 8 feet in exposed areas, covering fences and burying wagons and transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. The temperature dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, then to -18, then to -22. The cold was the kind that killed quickly, that froze exposed flesh in minutes and made breathing painful, and turned the world into a place where survival was a matter of shelter and fuel and nothing else. Caleb sat in his cave and listened to the storm rage outside. He had sealed the entrance door with rags stuffed into the cracks to prevent snow from drifting in, and he kept a small fire going in the stove more for light than for heat because the cave itself was warm enough. He made his daily rounds of the chambers, checking temperatures and humidity, examining the stored vegetables for any sign of stress. The readings were the same as they had been in September: 56 degrees, 55, 53, 48 in the lower level. The mountain did not notice the storm. The millions of tons of rock that surrounded him held their heat with the same patient indifference they had shown to every storm that had passed over this land, since the limestone was laid down in an ancient sea 450 million years before. He made entries in his journal each evening by lantern light, recording what he could observe from inside the cave. November 28th, storm arrived 2 p.m. Estimate outside temperature -15 degrees based on ice formation at entrance. Cave main chamber 56 degrees unchanged. November 29th, storm continues. Wind possibly 50 miles per hour based on sound. Cave chambers all stable. November 30th, third day of storm. Estimate 35 inches snow accumulation based on drift at entrance. All produce checked, all in perfect condition. The mountain holds. On December 1st, the storm ended. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, leaving a silence that was almost shocking after 3 days of continuous roar. Caleb dug himself out from the snow drift that had buried the entrance, working for 4 hours to clear a path to the surface. When he finally emerged into daylight, the world was transformed. Snow covered everything to a depth that made familiar landmarks unrecognizable. Trees had snapped under the weight of ice and snow. The sky was blue and clear and cold, the kind of cold that hurt to breathe. The temperature was -15 degrees. Caleb stood in the snow that came to his thighs and looked out over a landscape that was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Then he went back into the cave and brought out his journal and made his entry. December 1st, storm ended. Outside, temperature -15 degrees sustained. Inside, main chamber 56 degrees. Lower chamber 48 degrees. Total stored produce checked, no losses. The system works exactly as theory predicted. Over the next 4 days, as men dug themselves out from drifts that had buried barns and homes, as livestock was counted and losses tallied, the scope of the disaster became clear. Thomas Hartley was the first to discover what had happened, though he would not be the last. He had shoveled his way to the root cellar on December 2nd, expecting to find the vegetables cold perhaps, maybe showing some frost damage on the surface layers, but fundamentally intact the way they always were after a hard freeze. What he found instead was total destruction. The cellar that had been 4 feet deep, built exactly according to the method his father had taught him and his father before that, had frozen solid. The frost line, driven deeper by the sustained extreme cold, had reached 6 feet into the ground, penetrating the cellar from top and bottom and sides. The potatoes had frozen first, their high water content turning to ice that burst the cell walls and reduced them to black pulp. The turnips had followed, then the carrots and onions. 800 pounds of food, everything his family needed to supplement their diet through 4 months of winter, destroyed in 3 days of cold that no one had anticipated and no traditional method could defend against. Thomas stood in the cellar with the smell of rot already beginning, even in the freezing air, and felt something break inside him that was not quite hope but was close to it. He had 4 children and a wife 7 months pregnant and a long winter ahead with nothing but the cornmeal and salt pork he had stored in the house. The mathematics were brutal and simple. They would not starve, not immediately, but they would go hungry. The children would grow thin. The baby his wife carried would be born to a mother who had not eaten enough to make rich milk. Spring was 4 months away, and there was no margin for error, no reserve against sickness or accident or any of the other disasters that could befall a family living on the edge of adequacy. At Jackson's ranch, the discovery came later, but the impact was the same. Jackson had delayed checking the cellar, certain in the way that confidence makes a man certain that traditional methods would prove adequate. When he finally dug through the snow drift that covered the entrance and descended the ladder into the earth, he found ruins. 1,200 pounds of vegetables, all the potatoes and turnips and carrots that would have fed his family and his ranch hands, frozen solid and already beginning to rot. The smell hit him first, sweet and sick, the smell of biology breaking down faster than it should. Then the sight of it, the bins full of black mush that had been firm vegetables just a week before. He climbed back out of the cellar and stood in the snow thinking about pride and tradition, and the difference between what should work and what actually did. His father's method had failed. His grandfather's method had failed. Not because the method was wrong for normal conditions, but because these were not normal conditions. The failure was not in the design, but in the assumption that the future would be like the past. That experience was a sufficient guide for what was coming. It was a hard lesson, and it came at a price that was measured in hundreds of pounds of wasted food and the hunger that would follow. Worse than the vegetables was the livestock loss. 12 head of cattle, caught in the far pasture when the storm hit, had been unable to fight through drifts that were 8 feet deep in places to reach the shelter of the barn. They had frozen where they stood, their bodies preserved by the cold, monuments to the price of being unprepared for conditions that exceeded what experience predicted. The financial loss was $340, more money than Jackson had made in profit from last year's cattle sales. The loss stung not just because of the money, but because of what it represented, the failure of judgment that came from trusting too much in tradition and not enough in observation. Across the territory, the pattern repeated. 34 of the 38 families that lived within a day's ride of Redstone Creek had experienced complete root cellar failure. The frost line had penetrated to unprecedented depths, reaching 6 and 7 feet in some locations, far deeper than the traditional 4-foot cellars could protect against. The total estimated loss was 18,000 pounds of stored produce, food that families had counted on to survive until spring gardens could be planted and new food harvested. The science was simple. Traditional cellars relied on the Earth's natural insulation to prevent freezing, and in normal winters 4 feet of depth was adequate. But this was not a normal winter. The sustained extreme cold, -15 degrees for days at a time, had driven the frost line deeper than anyone had experienced. The traditional method, based on generations of observation during normal winters, had failed when faced with conditions outside the range of normal experience. Caleb's cave, based on geological principles rather than tradition, based on the understanding of thermal mass and the properties of limestone, had succeeded perfectly. The millions of tons of rock that surrounded his chambers had stored enough heat during the summer and fall to maintain their temperature regardless of what the weather did on the surface. The system was not dependent on the depth of soil or the thickness of straw. It was dependent on physics that did not change with the seasons, on the enormous heat capacity of stone, and the slow rate at which that heat could be conducted away through solid rock. By December 5th, hunger had not yet become desperate, but the mathematics of survival had become clear to everyone who could count. 4 months until spring. No stored vegetables. Grain supplies adequate, but grain alone could not sustain families through winter. Something would have to give. Either people would go hungry or they would have to find food somewhere. Caleb sat in his cave and thought about what he should do. The question was not simple and the answer was not obvious. He had 2,800 pounds of potato and 600 pounds of other vegetables, all in perfect condition, untouched by the frost that had destroyed everyone else's stores. He had food enough to feed 10 or 12 families through the winter if he was willing to share, enough to prevent hunger if not ensure comfort. The people who would come to him for help would be the same people who had called him cave fool, who had laughed about his potato hoarding, who had dismissed his warnings about a hard winter as the ravings of a man who spent too much time reading books and not enough time learning from experience. He could help them or he could let them suffer the consequences of their dismissal. Revenge would be easy, sweet, even. He could stand at the cave entrance and say, "I told you so," could remind each person who came begging for food that they had mocked him when he warned them, that they had called him fool when he prepared. The vindication would be complete. Not only had he been right about the cave's utility, he had been right about the severity of the coming winter. He had predicted both the problem and the solution, while they had laughed and dismissed and gone on with their traditional methods that had now failed them utterly. But even as he considered it, even as he imagined the satisfaction of refusing help to those who had refused to listen, Caleb knew he would not choose that path. Not because revenge was morally wrong, though his mother had taught him that it was, but because revenge required caring what others thought of him, and he had stopped caring about that years ago. His father's disapproval had taught him that lesson. If the opinion of the man who had raised him could not hurt him, the opinion of strangers certainly could not. The mathematics of the situation were clear. He could distribute 1,800 pounds and still maintain adequate reserves for his own needs. £1,800 divided among 12 families would provide each with 150 pounds of potatoes, enough for a family of 4 to supplement their other food supplies for 3 months. Not enough to prevent all hunger, but enough to prevent desperation. Enough that children would not grow hollow-eyed and thin. Enough that pregnant women would have the nutrition they needed to bring healthy babies into the world. He would help because helping was the right thing to do, because children should not go hungry for their parents' mistakes, because wisdom that was hoarded was not wisdom at all but merely knowledge kept useless, because the point of being right was not to prove others wrong but to use truth for the benefit of those who needed it. He had been given an inheritance that others thought worthless and had turned it into something valuable. That value should be used, not stored away like the gold a miser keeps buried in his cellar while the world starves around him. He spent the next 2 days organizing his inventory, calculating how much he could give away while maintaining enough reserves to last until spring. He set up his balance scale in the main chamber and opened his record book to a fresh page and waited. On December 12th, Thomas Hartley came walking up the trail to the cave. It was a 2-hour trek in snow that came to his waist in places, a journey that left him exhausted and red-faced from exertion. Caleb saw him coming from the cave entrance and went out to meet him. Thomas stood in the snow with his hat in his hands, unable to meet Caleb's eyes, and said, "Mr. Mercer, I got no right to ask." Caleb said, "Ask anyway." Thomas said, "My cellar froze through. I got 4 young ones and a wife expecting. I got nothing but cornmeal and a little salt pork to see us through to April." "How much do you need?" Caleb asked. Thomas looked up, surprised by the lack of recrimination, by the simple directness of the question. 4 months for 6 people, he said. "Maybe 400 pounds of potatoes if you could spare it. I will pay come spring. I will sell lambs and pay every penny." Caleb said, "Come inside." He led Thomas into the cave, into the warmth and stability of the main chamber where the potatoes sat on their shelves exactly as they had been since October. He weighed out 400 pounds on the balance scale, measuring precisely, and he weighed out 80 pounds of carrots and 40 pounds of onions, and he helped Thomas load it all into the sack he had brought. Thomas said, "Why are you helping me after what we all said?" Caleb said, "Because your children did not call me fool, and because it is the right thing to do." Thomas said, "I will pay, on my honor." Caleb said, "Pay what you can when you can. If spring is hard, call it a gift." Thomas left with the loaded sack on his back, struggling through the snow toward his farm and his waiting family. Caleb watched him go and then went back into the cave and made his first entry in the distribution ledger. December 12th, Thomas Hartley. 400 pounds potatoes, 80 pounds carrots, 40 pounds onions. Payment promised spring if able. He closed the book and looked at the shelves that still held more than 2,000 pounds of food. The winter was young yet. There would be others. By December 15th, Thomas Hartley had told 3 neighbors about the cave. By December 20th, 7 families had visited. By Christmas, everyone within a day's ride of Red Stone Creek knew that the cave fool had food and that the cave fool was sharing. The news spread the way news always spread in isolated communities, carried by women who talked at church, and men who gathered at the feed store, and children who repeated what they heard their parents say when they thought no one was listening. The man who lived in a hole in the ground, the man who had stored enough potatoes to feed a regiment, the man everyone had mocked for his foolishness, was the only man in the territory who had food to spare. They came in ones and twos, walking through snow that was still 3 feet deep in places, following the trail that Thomas Hartley had broken and that subsequent visitors had widened into something approaching a road. They came on foot because horses could not navigate the drifts and wagons were useless in conditions where the world was still frozen solid. They came with hats in their hands and shame on their faces, prepared to beg from a man they had called fool, prepared to accept whatever terms he set, because the alternative was watching their children go hungry. Caleb met each visitor at the cave entrance, standing in the doorway with the warmth of the cave at his back and the frozen world spread out before him. He did not make them wait. He did not make them explain themselves beyond what was necessary. He asked 3 questions and 3 questions only. How many in your family? What food do you have remaining? How much do you need to reach spring? The questions were practical, and the answers were honest because hunger has a way of cutting through pride and making a man tell the truth even when the truth is painful. Samuel Brecht arrived on December 16th with his 2 sons, young men in their 20s who worked the family farm and who had called Caleb Cave fool louder than most. Samuel stood at the entrance and said, "My cellar froze through. I got a wife and 4 children and these 2 boys. We got cornmeal and some dried beans but no vegetables at all." Caleb nodded and said, "Come inside." He led them into the main chamber where the shelves held rows of potatoes and turnips and carrots, all firm and dry, all perfect despite the cold that had destroyed everything else in the territory. Samuel looked at the systematic arrangement, at the thermometers hanging from the rock walls, at the careful organization that spoke of preparation and knowledge, and something changed in his face. "How much?" Caleb asked. Samuel did his calculations silently, counting on his fingers like a man who was more comfortable with dirt than with numbers. "For 7 people through 4 months," he said, "I figure 320 pounds of potatoes might do it if we are careful, plus whatever vegetables you can spare." Caleb walked to the scale he had set up in the corner, a balanced scale with 2 iron pans that gave weights accurate to the ounce, and he began measuring. 320 pounds of potatoes, 60 pounds of turnips, 40 pounds of carrots, 20 pounds of onions. He weighed each portion exactly, recording the amounts in his ledger with the same precision he brought to his temperature readings. The total came to 440 pounds. Samuel looked at the pile of food and said, "I can pay you come spring. I will sell a calf and pay cash money." Caleb said, "Pay what you can when you can. If you cannot pay, consider it a loan until better times." Samuel started to say something else and then stopped because there were no words for what he was feeling, which was gratitude mixed with shame in proportions he could not have measured even if he had possessed Caleb's scale and his careful way of quantifying the world. He and his sons loaded the food into sacks and began the long walk back to their farm, and Caleb watched them go and then made his entry in the ledger. December 16th. Samuel Brecht, 440 pounds total. Payment spring if able. They came steadily through the rest of December, each family carrying the weight of need and the burden of having dismissed the warnings that could have prevented their suffering. Earl Hoskins, who had laughed loudest about the cave fool in Tucker's Mercantile, arrived on December 18th with his hat in his hands and humility in his voice that was painful to hear from a man who had always spoken with certainty. He stood at the cave entrance unable to look Caleb in the eye and said, "My pride has cost my family dear. I would ask for help if you would give it." Caleb measured out 280 pounds of potatoes and 60 pounds of turnips and said nothing about pride or mockery or the difference between being right and being kind. Mary Morrison, a widow with 3 children whose husband had died 2 years before in a logging accident, came on December 20th and stood in the cave's warmth looking at the stored food with eyes that filled with tears she was too proud to let fall. She had managed alone for 2 years, taking in sewing and selling eggs, and doing whatever work a woman could do to feed 3 growing children without a man's income. The blizzard had destroyed the root cellar she had dug herself, 4 feet deep exactly as every cellar should be, and now she stood facing the reality that she could not do it alone this time. "How much do you need?" Caleb asked, and his voice was gentle because he understood what it cost a proud woman to ask for charity. Mary calculated silently, her lips moving as she counted months and mouths and the minimum required to prevent hunger. 180 pounds of potatoes, she said. If you could spare it. I cannot pay now, but I will take in extra sewing and pay what I can when I can. Caleb measured out 180 pounds of potatoes and added 40 pounds of carrots and 20 pounds of onions without being asked and without expectation of payment. When Mary started to protest, he said, "Consider it an investment in your children's future. They will remember kindness and maybe pass it on when their turn comes." Jacob Miller, whose wagon mishap had been the subject of jokes for months before Caleb's potato hoarding replaced it as the primary source of community entertainment, arrived on December 22nd and had the grace to acknowledge the irony. "I guess we all look like fools when we make mistakes," he said. "The difference is your mistake fed people and mine just gave them something to laugh about." Caleb gave him 260 pounds of potatoes and accepted a promise of 2 spring lambs as payment, knowing that Jacob raised good stock and that the promise would be kept if the man was able to keep it. There were others. Benjamin Cross, a farmer in his 70s who had built root cellars the same way for 50 years and had never seen one fail until this winter. Sarah Whitman, whose husband was laid up with a broken leg and could not work, and whose family depended entirely on stored food to survive until spring. The Hernandez family, who spoke limited English but whose need required no translation. Young Daniel Foster, barely 20, who had married in the fall and was trying to provide for a pregnant wife with no experience and limited resources. Caleb kept meticulous records. Each family's name, the date of their visit, the exact weight of each type of vegetable, the payment promised, or the notation that payment was not expected. The ledger grew day by day, a chronicle of need and response, of hunger met with food and shame met with dignity. He did not lecture. He did not remind anyone of his warnings or their mockery. He simply weighed the food, recorded the transaction, helped load the sacks, and wished each family well. The work was repetitive and exhausting and strangely satisfying, like all work that serves a clear purpose and meets a genuine need. By December 25th, Christmas Day, Caleb had distributed 1,680 pounds of potatoes and 420 pounds of other vegetables to 13 families. His stores, which had started at 2,800 pounds of potatoes and 600 pounds of other produce, were diminishing at a rate that he tracked carefully in his daily calculations. He still had 1,120 pounds of potatoes and 180 pounds of other vegetables, enough to feed himself through spring with a comfortable margin, and enough to help a few more families if they came. The mathematics were tight but adequate. He would not run out. He would not have to turn anyone away who truly needed help. On December 28th, 3 days after Christmas, Jackson Mercer came to the cave. Caleb saw him from a distance, walking alone through the snow, not riding as Jackson usually did because the drifts were still too deep for horses. Jackson walked with his head down against the cold, his coat pulled tight, his breath visible in clouds that dissipated quickly in air that was still well below freezing. He walked like a man who had made a decision he did not want to make but could not avoid, each step deliberate and reluctant. Caleb met him at the entrance and said, "Come in." Jackson stepped into the cave and stopped, looking around at the main chamber with eyes that took in everything. The shelving that was built with mortise and tenon joints and raised on stone footings, the thermometers hanging at precise intervals, the humidity gauges, the careful organization of the stored vegetables, separated by type and arranged for optimal air circulation, the balance scale. The ledger open on the wooden desk where Caleb kept his records. This was not the primitive hole in the ground that Jackson had imagined. This was a sophisticated operation, more carefully planned and more precisely executed than the traditional cellar that Jackson had built according to methods he thought were proven. Jackson stood in the middle of the chamber and looked at his younger brother and said, "I lost 12 head in the storm. My cellar froze complete. Everything I stored is ruined. Caleb waited, saying nothing, knowing that Jackson had come for a reason and would get to it when he was ready. How much do you need? Caleb asked. Jackson looked at the shelves and then back at Caleb and said, I can pay. I am not like the others. I have money put aside. That is not what I asked, Caleb said. How much do you need? The conversation that followed was brief and awkward. Two brothers who had not spoken in months, navigating the space between pride and necessity. Jackson needed 360 pounds of potatoes to supplement his family's food supply through the rest of winter. He needed 70 pounds of turnips and carrots. He had the money to pay, and he wanted to pay because paying would preserve some measure of dignity in a transaction that already felt like defeat. Caleb measured out the food with the same care he brought to every distribution. He weighed it exactly. He recorded it in his ledger. He helped Jackson load it into the sacks he had brought. At the cave entrance, ready to leave, Jackson turned back and said, Why help me after Father gave you nothing? Caleb looked at his brother and said, He gave me 540 acres, same as he gave you 640. Jackson said, You know what I mean. The land was worthless. Caleb gestured around at the cave, at the limestone walls that held their ancient warmth, at the system he had built from observation and knowledge. Was it, he said, seems valuable now. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, I mocked you. The whole town did. You have every right to refuse. Caleb said, Right does not feed your family. Jackson hoisted one of the sacks onto his shoulder and said, You are a better man than I am, little brother. Caleb said, I am just a man who happened to have potatoes. Jackson left, walking back through the snow toward his ranch and his waiting family. And Caleb watched him go and thought about inheritance and value, and the difference between what a man is given and what a man makes of it. He went back inside and made his entry in the ledger. December 28th, Jackson Mercer. 360 pounds potatoes, 70 pounds turnips and carrots. Payment received in cash, $12. He closed the book and sat for a while thinking about his father and about the will that had seemed so unfair 8 months before. Nathaniel had given Jackson the easy inheritance, the land that required no thought beyond what tradition had already established. He had given Caleb the puzzle, the land that seemed worthless until a man understood what it actually was. Looking back now, Caleb could see which gift had been more valuable. The gift that required nothing had produced nothing new. The gift that required everything had produced something that would last. On January 15th, 6 weeks into winter, a visitor arrived who had not come for food. Dr. Wilhelm Brennan rode up to the cave on a gray mare that picked its way carefully through the packed snow, with his daughter Catherine riding behind him on a chestnut gelding. Caleb saw them coming and went out to meet them, curious because the Brennan family was German immigrants who had settled in the valley 2 years before, and who were known for keeping to themselves, and for the herbal medicines that Wilhelm prepared from plants he grew in a greenhouse he had built with his own hands. Wilhelm Brennan was in his 60s, white-haired and lean, with the erect posture of a man who had spent his life in academic halls before immigrating to a place where his learning mattered less than his ability to grow things. He dismounted and approached Caleb with his hand extended and said, Mr. Mercer, I am Wilhelm Brennan and this is my daughter Catherine. I have heard about your storage system and I wonder if I might study it. Caleb shook his hand and said, Study it. Yes, Wilhelm said. I am a botanist by training. Your preservation success interests me professionally. Catherine Brennan dismounted and stood beside her father, and Caleb saw her clearly for the first time. She was 27 years old, tall and angular with dark hair pulled back severely from a face that was more interesting than beautiful. She wore practical clothing, wool pants under a riding skirt, boots that were made for function, not fashion, a heavy coat that had been mended in several places. In her hands she carried a leather notebook and a pencil, tools of observation rather than decoration. Her eyes, when she looked at Caleb, were alert and assessing, the eyes of someone who was used to seeing what others missed. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language but had learned it well. "My father has told me about your cave storage. I would very much like to understand how you maintain such stable conditions." Caleb looked from father to daughter and said, "Come inside." He led them into the main chamber, watching their reactions as they took in the scope of what he had built. Wilhelm went immediately to the nearest thermometer and studied it with the intensity of a man reading a text in his native language. Catherine pulled out her notebook and began writing, quick, precise notes in a hand that was almost too small to read. "What is the humidity range?" she asked. 65 to 70%, Caleb said. "How stable is the diurnal temperature variation? Less than 1 degree across 24 hours. Have you documented air circulation patterns?" He had, and he showed her his journal where 6 months of observations were recorded in daily entries. She read through the pages with the focus of someone for whom data was more interesting than conversation, asking questions that were technical and specific, questions that assumed knowledge of thermodynamics and geological principles that most people did not possess. Wilhelm examined the shelving and the ventilation channels and the storage method with the critical eye of a scientist evaluating experimental results. Catherine studied the temperature logs and the humidity measurements and the careful records of which vegetables stored best at which temperatures. After an hour of examination, they stood together in the center of the chamber and Wilhelm said, "Remarkable. You have replicated European wine cellar conditions using entirely natural processes." Caleb said, "You have studied European methods." Catherine answered, "I studied with my father at Heidelberg University before we immigrated. Cave storage is well documented in Germany." "I read about it," Caleb said. "I never thought I would create one." Catherine looked at him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been simple interest in a fellow observer. "You did not create," she said. "You discovered. The cave was always this temperature. You just recognized its value." The distinction seemed important to her, and Caleb nodded because it was important to him too. There was a difference between making something and understanding something that already existed. One required engineering, the other required observation. Both had value, but they were not the same. "Might I return?" Catherine asked, "to document your system properly?" Caleb said, "Why? Because knowledge unused is knowledge wasted," she said. "Your methods could help others." "Others called me fool," Caleb said. Catherine met his eyes and said, "Others were wrong. I prefer to learn from people who are right." There was a directness to her that Caleb found both unsettling and oddly comfortable. She did not soften her words or hide her intelligence behind false modesty. She said what she thought and expected others to do the same. They left before dark, riding back down the trail toward their farm, and Caleb stood at the cave entrance watching them go and thinking about the difference between visitors who came for food and visitors who came for knowledge. Both were forms of need, but they required different responses. Food he could measure and distribute according to objective calculations. Knowledge was harder to quantify, harder to know how much to share and how much to keep for himself as competitive advantage. He went back inside and made a note in his journal. January 15th. Dr. Wilhelm Brennan and daughter Catherine visited to study cave storage methods. Daughter, trained botanist, requests permission to return and document system. Decision pending. The deep cold returned in late January. From January 20th through January 30th, the temperature dropped and stayed dropped, hovering between -10 and -18 degrees for 10 consecutive days. The cold was the kind that made metal brittle and trees crack and breath freeze instantly in beards and mustaches. Livestock that survived the blizzard suffered through this second assault, burning through hay supplies faster than anyone had calculated. requiring supplemental feeding that ate into reserves meant to last through February and March. The sustained cold drove the frost line even deeper into the ground, reaching depths that would not fully thaw until May. During these 10 days, Caleb had 6 more visitors, families whose initial food supplies had proven inadequate and who needed additional help to make it through to spring. He gave each family what they needed, weighing and recording with the same care he had shown from the beginning, but his stores were diminishing in ways that required careful calculation to ensure he did not run out before winter ended. By the end of January, he had distributed a total of 2,020 pounds of potatoes and 540 pounds of other vegetables. His remaining stores were 780 pounds of potatoes and 60 pounds of other produce. The mathematics were tight. 780 pounds for himself from February through April was adequate but not generous. If more families came, if the winter lasted longer than expected, if any of a dozen variables changed in ways he had not predicted, he might run short. On January 31st, he made a decision that was harder than any he had made so far. He would help current families who needed more, but he would not take on new commitments. The next family who came asking for food who had not already received help would be told that his supplies were committed, and he could not help them. The refusal came on February 3rd. A family from over the ridge, people Caleb did not know well, arrived at the cave entrance asking for help. The man was in his 40s, lean and worn-looking, with a wife who was visibly pregnant and 3 children who had the hollow-eyed look of sustained hunger. Caleb listened to their story, calculated what they needed, and then said, "I am sorry. I have committed what I can spare to families already receiving help. I have to ensure those commitments are met." The man said, "But we are hungry. My wife is carrying and the children have not had vegetables in 2 months." "I know," Caleb said, and the words were harder to say than any he had spoken during the entire winter. "I am sorry. I cannot help everyone. If I give to you, I risk not being able to fulfill promises I have already made." The man stood there for a long moment, his face showing anger and desperation in equal measure, and then he turned and walked away without another word, his family following behind him. Caleb watched them go and felt something close to grief, knowing he had made the right choice, but hating that the right choice meant turning away hungry children. He went back inside and sat at his desk for a long time, thinking about limits and responsibility and the difference between what a man wants to do and what a man can do. He had helped 20 families. He could not help 21. The limitation was mathematical and absolute. There was only so much food. There were only so many months until spring. The cave's capacity was finite. His own needs were real. Accepting these limits was maturity, not failure, but that knowledge did not make the acceptance any easier. On February 8th, an unexpected warm spell arrived, one of those brief reprieves that Wyoming winters sometimes offer when Arctic air retreats and Pacific air flows in to take its place. For 3 days, the temperature rose to 45 degrees during the day, warm enough to melt the top layer of snow and create streams of meltwater that ran down every slope. The effect on the cave was minimal but measurable. The main chamber temperature, which had held steady at 56 degrees for 5 months, rose to 58 degrees. The humidity, which had been 68%, rose to 78%. Caleb noticed the change immediately because he checked the instruments twice daily and recorded the readings with the precision of a scientist monitoring an experiment. He adjusted the ventilation, opening the entrance door slightly at night to allow cooler air to flow through, closing it during the day when the outside air was warmer than the cave interior. The adjustments helped, but they did not completely counteract the warming trend. For 3 days, the cave was warmer and more humid than optimal, and on the 4th day, Caleb found the consequence. A section of potatoes in the upper chamber, perhaps 80 pounds worth, had developed soft spots. The potatoes were not frozen and they were not completely rotten, but they showed the beginning of breakdown, the cellular damage that came from temperature fluctuation and excess moisture. Caleb removed the affected potatoes immediately, separating them from the healthy stock, and carried them outside where the cold would prevent further deterioration until he could decide what to do with them. It was the first loss he had experienced since he began storing food in October, the first failure of a system he had believed was nearly perfect. He spent the rest of that day examining every potato on every shelf, checking for soft spots and early rot, removing anything that showed the slightest sign of damage. The total loss was 82 pounds, small in the context of the nearly 3,000 pounds he had stored originally, but significant because it represented a failure of understanding. He had assumed the cave's temperature stability was absolute. He had learned it was merely very good, subject to variation when outside conditions were extreme enough. The system was resilient but not infallible. Nature always had variables that could not be completely controlled. By February 10th, the warm spell had ended, and the temperature dropped back to normal winter levels. The cave temperature returned to 56 degrees, and the humidity dropped to 69%. Caleb made adjustments to the ventilation system, creating a more sophisticated arrangement of openings and closures that would allow him to regulate airflow more precisely in response to outside conditions. The work took 3 days, and when it was done, he had a system that was more responsive and more stable than what he had started with. The loss of 80 pounds had taught him something valuable about the limits of passive systems and the need for active management. Catherine Brennan returned on February 15th as she had said she would, arriving in mid-morning when the light was best for taking measurements and making observations. She came alone this time, riding the chestnut gelding through snow that was beginning to show signs of the compaction that came from repeated freezing and thawing, the surface developing the hard crust that could support a horse's weight in the morning before the sun softened it. She carried her notebook and a leather satchel that held additional instruments she had ordered from a catalog, a mercury thermometer more precise than Caleb's that could measure to tenths of a degree, a hygrometer that measured humidity with greater accuracy, using a human hair that lengthened and shortened with moisture changes, a small barometer for tracking atmospheric pressure that she believed might correlate with the cave's temperature fluctuations. She also brought questions, dozens of them, written in her careful script in a notebook that was already half filled with observations and hypotheses and preliminary conclusions. They worked together through the afternoon, Catherine taking measurements at 5 different locations in the main chamber to map the temperature gradient, making notes while Caleb explained the ventilation system he had built and the modifications he had made after the warm spell in early February. She asked about the temperature differential between the floor and ceiling. She asked whether he had noticed any correlation between outside barometric pressure and inside temperature stability. She asked whether he had tested different spacing patterns for the shelves to determine optimal air circulation. Some of her questions he could answer from his journals, where 5 months of daily observations were recorded in meticulous detail. Others required new experiments, new measurements, new ways of thinking about phenomena he had observed but not fully analyzed. They spent an hour in the middle chamber testing her theory that air circulation created predictable temperature stratification, using candle smoke to trace air currents and thermometers to measure the vertical temperature gradient. They found that she was correct, that the chamber was half a degree warmer at ceiling height than at floor level, a difference so small that most people would have dismissed it as measurement error, but which Catherine insisted was significant for understanding how the system worked. When the light began to fail and the temperature dropped and it was time for her to leave, Catherine stood at the cave entrance organizing her notes and said almost as an afterthought, "You should keep records of produce quality, not just temperature. Rot patterns, sprouting rates, firmness degradation over time. That data would be valuable for understanding optimal storage duration for different varieties." Caleb said, "You want me to add more record keeping to what I already do?" Catherine looked up from her notebook and smiled slightly and said, "I want you to approach this as science, not just as practice. Science requires comprehensive data even when the patterns are not immediately obvious." The distinction she was making was important. Practice meant doing what worked. Science meant understanding why it worked. Caleb had been practicing storage. Catherine wanted him to be doing science. The difference seemed small, but it implied a fundamentally different approach to knowledge, a shift from immediate utility to long-term understanding. He found himself agreeing to her request, not because he saw the immediate value, but because the way she thought about the world interested him in ways that had nothing to do with potatoes or limestone or temperature gradients. She came back 2 days later with a proposal written out in formal language. She wanted to publish a paper documenting the cave storage system for the Wyoming Agricultural Review, a quarterly publication that circulated among farmers and ranchers and agricultural scientists across the territory. The paper would describe the geological principles, the temperature data, the storage methods, and the results Caleb had achieved. It would be co-authored, her name and his name together, acknowledging both the discoverer of the system and the documenter of its principles. Caleb read the proposal and then read it again and said, "If we publish this, anyone could replicate it. Anyone with a cave could do what I am doing." Catherine nodded and said, "Yes, and that is exactly what should happen. Knowledge that helps people should be shared, not hoarded." He said, "But it gives me competitive advantage. If others can do it, why would they pay me for storage?" She said, "Because most people do not have caves, because your operation is already established. Because there is enough need for everyone who can provide this service. And because keeping knowledge secret makes you no better than the men who dismissed you for having knowledge they did not understand." The argument went on for an hour, Caleb defending the practical value of proprietary information, Catherine insisting on the moral imperative of sharing knowledge that served the common good. Neither convinced the other completely, but they reached a compromise. They would publish after Caleb had established his business and secured enough customers that competition would not destroy his livelihood. They would document now and release later, building a comprehensive record that could be shared when the time was right. It was not a perfect solution, but it allowed both of them to maintain their principles while acknowledging the validity of the other's concerns. By the end of February, Catherine was visiting twice weekly, arriving in the morning and staying until late afternoon, always with her notebook, always with new questions, always with suggestions that were based on scientific principles rather than intuition. She proposed modifications to the ventilation system that would create more stable airflow using the principle of differential pressure. She suggested that the lower chambers, which Caleb had mentioned briefly but had not fully described, would be ideal for apple and dairy storage if they could be accessed safely, and if the humidity could be controlled precisely. The relationship that developed between them over these weeks was complex and difficult to categorize. It was not romantic in any conventional sense. They did not touch except by accident when reaching for the same instrument. They did not speak of personal matters except as they related to their work. Catherine never asked about his family or his past beyond what was necessary to understand how he had learned what he knew. Caleb never asked about her life in Germany, or why her family had immigrated, or why a woman with her education had ended up in Wyoming territory, where education was valued less than strength and traditional knowledge. But there was an intimacy in their collaboration that went deeper than social convention allowed for, a meeting of minds that was rarer and more valuable than the meeting of bodies that most people called romance. They argued and agreed and discovered together, building understanding not just of the cave system, but of how knowledge was created and validated and shared. Caleb found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with needing help, and everything to do with enjoying the presence of someone who saw the world the way he did, as a series of questions waiting to be answered through observation and reason. Wilhelm noticed the change in his daughter, the way she smiled more when she came back from the cave, the way she talked about Caleb's observations with the enthusiasm of someone who had found an intellectual equal, rather than just an interesting subject for study. He said nothing, but he watched and approved, seeing in Caleb qualities that were rare in Wyoming territory, education and curiosity, and a willingness to learn from observation rather than from tradition. If his daughter was going to marry, and at 27 she was of an age where marriage was becoming less likely with each passing year, better she marry a man who valued her mind than a man who valued only her domestic skills. March arrived with the slow, reluctant warming that characterized spring in Wyoming. The snow began to melt in earnest, creating streams where there had been only ice, exposing ground that had been covered since November. The temperature rose above freezing during the day, dropping back below at night in a pattern that would continue for weeks as winter gave up its hold 1 degree at a time. On March 28th, the temperature stayed above freezing for 24 consecutive hours, the first time that had happened since October, and Caleb knew that winter was effectively over even though snow would continue to fall occasionally through April and sometimes into May. He made his final distributions in late March, giving additional supplies to families who had exhausted what he had provided earlier and who needed help through the last few weeks before spring greens could be harvested from the fields. His stores, which had started at 2,800 pounds of potatoes, were down to 180 pounds. The last of the turnips and carrots and onions had been distributed. The cave chambers, which had been full in October, were nearly empty now, showing only the bare shelves and the careful organization that had made the storage possible. Caleb made his accounting in the ledger on March 30th. 24 families helped. 2,240 pounds of potatoes distributed. 540 pounds of other vegetables distributed. Total loss to temperature fluctuation 82 pounds. Payments promised $340. Payments received $85 in cash plus various promises of lambs and calves and labor to be provided in spring and summer. The financial return was modest, but the human return was immeasurable. Nobody had starved. Nobody had lost children to hunger. The winter that had promised disaster had passed, and the community had survived because one man had understood geology and had been willing to share what his understanding produced. The name Cave Fool disappeared from common usage that winter, replaced by something more complicated. People did not know quite what to call a man who had outsmarted the worst winter in memory through nothing but books and observation and patience. Some called him clever, some called him lucky. A few, the honest ones, called him wise. Catherine Brennan, who had spent 2 months studying his methods and arguing with him about knowledge and documentation and the responsibility that came with understanding, called him something else. She called him a partner, though neither of them had explicitly discussed what kind of partnership she meant. On April 3rd, Catherine came to the cave with a question that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity or ventilation. They were standing outside the entrance, watching the valley below where patches of bare ground were beginning to show through the melting snow, and she said, "You have proven the system works. Now we should build it properly." Caleb looked at her and said, "It is built properly." She shook her head and said, "I mean expand it. Offer storage services. Charge fees. Make this a business instead of just a personal operation." "Why would I do that?" Caleb asked. Catherine looked at him with the directness that he had come to expect from her and said, "Because you have knowledge that others need. Because you can provide a service that has value. Because wisdom that is kept to yourself dies with you, but wisdom that is shared multiplies and improves." He was quiet for a long moment, thinking about what she was proposing, about the shift from simply surviving to actually building something that would last beyond one winter, beyond one man's lifetime. "What would you want from this?" he asked. Catherine said, "Partnership. I provide engineering improvements and documentation. You provide the operation and the property. We build something together that serves the community and validates the principles we both believe in." Caleb looked at this woman who had appeared in his life 6 weeks ago and who had somehow become essential to how he thought about the future. He said, "I will think about it." Catherine smiled, a rare expression that changed her face from interesting to actually beautiful, and said, "That is all I ask." She rode away down the trail, and Caleb stood watching until she disappeared around the bend where the aspen grew thick. Then he went back into the cave and sat at his desk and opened his journal to a fresh page. April 3, 1874, he wrote, "Winter officially ended. All families accounted for, all survived. Catherine Brennan proposes business partnership to expand cave storage operation. Proposal has merit. Decision requires consideration of long-term goals versus short-term security. Note to self, the difference between survival and building is the difference between accepting what you have and reaching for what could be." He closed the journal and looked around the main chamber, at the empty shelves that would be full again come fall, at the limestone walls that had held their warmth through the coldest winter anyone could remember, at the thermometer that still read 56 degrees exactly as it had in October. The cave had saved him, and it had saved his neighbors. The question now was whether it could be more than just salvation, whether it could be foundation. Whether what he had stumbled into by accident of inheritance could be turned into something deliberately built and carefully maintained and passed on to whatever came next. Outside, the snow continued to melt, and the creek began to run, and the first birds returned from wherever they had gone to escape the winter. Spring was coming the way spring always came, slowly and reluctantly and inevitably, and with it came possibility. Catherine's proposal sat on Caleb's desk for 3 days before he gave her his answer. 3 days during which he worked alone in the cave chambers, preparing them for the next season's storage, repairing shelves that had been damaged by the weight of winter provisions, adjusting ventilation channels that had proven inadequate during the warm spell in February. The work gave him time to think about what partnership meant, about the difference between working alone as he had always done and building something with another person who brought skills and knowledge he did not possess. The decision was not simple. Partnership meant sharing control, sharing decisions, sharing the risk that came with trying to turn a survival operation into a legitimate business. It meant trusting someone else with information he had guarded carefully, with methods that gave him advantage over anyone who might try to compete. It meant accepting that his cave, his discovery, his system would no longer be entirely his own. But it also meant having help with the work that was becoming more than one person could manage. It meant having someone who understood the science behind what he was doing and who could improve on methods that were effective but could be better. It meant not being alone. On April 6, 1874, Caleb rode down to the Brennan farm and found Catherine in the greenhouse her father had built, tending to seedlings that would be transplanted to the garden once the danger of frost had passed. She looked up when he entered, her hands covered with soil, her hair pulled back with a piece of twine, and she said nothing, just waited for him to speak. "Your proposal has merit," he said. "If we do this, we split it equal. 50-50 on all decisions, all profits, all risks. I provide the property and the existing system. You provide improvements in documentation and client relations. She wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Agreed. When do we start?" They started immediately. The first task was to formalize the operation, to transform what had been an emergency response to winter disaster into a service that people could rely on year after year. Catherine drew up contracts that specified terms and prices, simple one-page agreements that protected both the storage provider and the customer. The rate they settled on was 60 cents per £100 per season, paid half at storage time and half at retrieval. The price was fair, higher than what farmers paid for ice storage when that option existed, but lower than the cost of building and maintaining a proper root cellar that might fail when conditions exceeded normal parameters. Caleb built additional shelving in the middle chamber, expanding capacity from the 2,800 pounds he had stored the previous fall to a potential 4,000 pounds if every shelf was filled to maximum safe density. Catherine engineered improvements to the ventilation system using principles of differential pressure and convection that she had learned in her university studies, creating channels that enhanced the cave's natural air circulation without requiring mechanical fans or other equipment that would need maintenance and eventual replacement. The work took all of April and most of May, two people working together in the cool darkness of the cave, their collaboration becoming so smooth that they often worked in silence, each knowing what the other needed without having to ask. In late May, Caleb made a discovery that changed how he understood his inheritance and his father's intentions. He was cleaning out an old desk that had belonged to Nathaniel, a battered piece of furniture that had come with the wagon when Caleb first arrived at the property, when he found a hidden compartment behind one of the drawers. The compartment held a single folded letter, yellowed with age, addressed in his father's handwriting. To Caleb, the envelope read, "Open when the land proves its value." Caleb sat on the edge of his sleeping platform and read the letter by lantern light, his hands shaking slightly because he had not expected to hear his father's voice again, had thought that whatever Nathaniel had wanted to say had been said in the will that divided the estate so unequally. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Nathaniel's death, written in the careful script of a man who was more comfortable with rope and leather than with pen and paper, but who had something important to communicate. "Son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, you have found use for that rocky hillside. I expected you would, though maybe not this quick. I never told you, but 15 years back a surveyor showed me geological charts. Said there were caves in those hills, limestone formations. He mentioned something about stable temperatures, but I did not understand the science of it. The way you understand things I never could. I gave Jackson the easy land because he needs easy. Strong back, simple mind, he will do fine with something straightforward. I gave Robert the lumber because it is established business. He will run it adequate, probably sell it eventually. I gave you the puzzle because you are the one who solves puzzles. You read those books I never understood. You asked questions I could not answer. I figured if any son of mine could turn rocks into value, it would be you. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I am a fool for testing you this way. But I believe a man shows his worth not by what he is given, but by what he makes of it. Your brothers will do fine with their inheritances. They will ranch and saw timber and live the lives their grandfathers lived. But you, Caleb, if you figure this out, you will do something none of us expected. Do not be angry I did not make it easy. Easy does not build character. Your father, Nathaniel Mercer." There was a postscript at the bottom of the page, added in a shakier hand as though Nathaniel's strength had been failing when he wrote it. "Do not tell your brothers," it read. "Let them think what they want. The truth would not help them and might hurt. Some men need to believe their success comes from their own merit rather than from gifts they were given." Caleb read the letter 3 times, trying to reconcile this version of his father with the man he had known, the man who had seemed disappointed in everything Caleb did, and who had dismissed book learning as a waste of time that could be better spent on practical work. The man who wrote this letter had understood more than he had let on, had seen potential where Caleb had only felt rejection, had given the hardest gift because he believed it was the gift most suited to the son who received it. The knowledge did not erase the years of feeling inadequate and dismissed, but it reframed them, turned disappointment into challenge, turned what had seemed like punishment into something closer to faith. He showed the letter to Catherine that evening, needing to share the discovery with someone who would understand what it meant. She read it carefully, her face showing the concentration she brought to everything, and when she finished she looked at Caleb and said, "He knew. He knew what you were capable of even if he could not say it while he was alive." Caleb said, "He tested me. He gave me the hardest gift to see if I could make something of it." Catherine said, "And you did. You made something that saved lives. That is worth more than easy land or established business." They decided together not to tell Jackson or Robert about the letter's existence. The decision was not made from cruelty, but from the same understanding that Nathaniel had possessed when he wrote the postscript. Jackson had his pride and his certainty that he had earned his inheritance through being the eldest and the most traditionally capable. Robert had his sawmill, and whatever satisfaction he took from running an established operation. Telling them that their father had given them lesser gifts because he thought them capable of less would serve no purpose except to hurt. Sometimes kindness meant keeping the truth private. The summer of 1874 was a season of building, both literal and figurative. Caleb and Catherine worked together to establish the business on a foundation that would sustain it beyond a single season's success. They visited farms and ranches throughout the territory, riding together on horses that picked their way along trails that were barely more than game paths in some places, carrying samples of their temperature logs and documentation that showed what the cave system could do. The visits were educational exercises as much as sales calls. Catherine would explain the science of thermal mass and how limestone held stable temperatures, speaking with the authority of someone who had studied at a European university. Caleb would show the practical results, vegetables from the previous season that had remained firm and edible through months of storage that would have destroyed them in a traditional cellar. The farmers they visited were mostly skeptical. Wyoming ranchers and homesteaders were practical people who trusted experience over theory and who had built root cellars the same way for generations. The fact that those cellars had failed catastrophically the previous winter made them willing to listen, but not necessarily willing to believe that a cave would work better than what they knew. Some refused outright, saying they would dig deeper cellars or build better insulation, or take their chances with another mild winter. Others were interested, but wanted to see results before committing to a new method. But some, perhaps a third of the families they visited, were willing to try something different because the alternative was risking another winter of hunger. By August they had contracts with 18 families, each agreement written in Catherine's precise handwriting on paper she had purchased from Tucker's Mercantile. The contracts were simple, specifying the amount to be stored, the rate of 60 cents per 100 pounds, the payment schedule, and the responsibilities of both parties. Caleb was responsible for maintaining the cave at appropriate temperatures and humidity, for providing adequate shelf space with proper air circulation, for keeping accurate records of what was stored and when. The customer was responsible for delivering vegetables in good condition, for paying on time, and for retrieving their stored goods by May 1st to make room for the next season's storage. The 18 contracts represented approximately 2,400 pounds of vegetables that would arrive in October and November, filling the expanded shelving that Caleb had built in the middle chamber and using part of the main chamber's capacity. The projected revenue was $144 if everyone paid as agreed, a sum that seemed substantial to Caleb, who had lived on very little for most of his life, but which Catherine pointed out was barely adequate compensation for the work involved. They were not building this business to get rich, she said. They were building it to prove a principle and to provide a service. The money matters, but it is not what matters most. More important than the money was the principle being established, the idea that natural systems properly understood could provide services that mechanical systems could not match. Caleb and Catherine were not just storing vegetables. They were demonstrating that observation and knowledge could triumph over tradition and assumption, that understanding how the world actually worked was more valuable than doing things the way they had always been done, because that was how they had always been done. In September, as the first contracts were being fulfilled, and the first loads of potatoes and turnips were being delivered to the cave for storage, something shifted in the relationship between Caleb and Catherine that neither of them had anticipated or planned. They were working late one evening, arranging newly delivered potatoes on the shelves in the middle chamber, when Catherine stopped in the middle of a sentence about optimal spacing for air circulation and said, "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with vegetables?" Caleb set down the potato he was holding and said, "Ask." "Why did you never marry?" she said. The question was direct in the way all her questions were direct, asked without embarrassment or artifice. Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer honestly without revealing more than he wanted to reveal. "I never found a woman who was interested in rocks," he said. Catherine smiled, a rare expression that transformed her face from merely interesting to something more. "I am interested in rocks," she said. "Are you?" Caleb said, and realized as he said it what the words might mean beyond their literal content. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Then Catherine said, "I should go. Father will worry if I am too late." And Caleb said, "Stay for supper. I will walk you home after." The invitation was simple, but it represented a crossing of some line that had existed between professional collaboration and personal connection. Catherine hesitated for just a moment and then said, "All right, I will stay." They ate bread and cheese and apples in the main chamber, sitting on the edge of Caleb's sleeping platform, because he had no table suitable for dining, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity or business contracts. Catherine told him about growing up in Germany, about studying at Heidelberg, where her father had taught before political troubles and financial pressures had forced the family to immigrate. Caleb told her about his brothers and his father's disappointment, and the years of feeling like he did not fit into the world he had been born into. The conversation was awkward at first, both of them more comfortable with scientific discussion than with personal revelation, but it became easier as the evening progressed, and they discovered that they were interested in each other as people and not just as collaborators. When it was time to walk Catherine home, Caleb saddled his horse and they rode together through darkness that was broken only by starlight and the thin crescent of a new moon. At the boundary of the Brennan property, Catherine dismounted and turned to face him and said, "Thank you for supper. And for the conversation. We should do it again." Caleb said, "We should." Catherine smiled and walked toward the house where lamplight showed in the windows, and Caleb sat on his horse watching until she went inside and the door closed behind her. Over the following weeks, they continued their work on the storage operation, but they also continued the personal conversations that had started that September evening. The change was gradual and unforced. Catherine came to the cave not just in the afternoons for work, but sometimes in the evenings for supper, and talk that ranged far beyond vegetables and temperature gradients. Caleb visited the Brennan farm on Sundays after the work week was done, helping Wilhelm with tasks around the greenhouse, repairing the glass panels that had cracked during winter storms, building new benches for seed starting, doing the physical work that an aging academic could no longer manage alone. The conversations during these visits revealed depths that neither of them had shown during their professional collaboration. Catherine talked about growing up as the only child of a university professor, about feeling isolated from other children who did not understand why a girl would want to study plants instead of learning embroidery and household management. She talked about the decision to immigrate, about leaving behind everything familiar to follow her father to a place where his education meant less than his ability to grow medicinal herbs that frontier doctors needed. She talked about the loneliness of being an educated woman in a place where education was rare and female education was viewed with suspicion. Caleb talked about his own isolation, about being the youngest son who disappointed a father by preferring books to cattle, about the years of feeling like he did not belong in his own family or in the community where he was raised. He talked about the cave discovery and the months of working alone, about the strange satisfaction of building something from understanding rather than from tradition. He talked about the winter when everyone had called him fool, and how the mockery had hurt less than he expected, because he had already learned not to depend on others' approval for his sense of worth. The recognition that grew between them was based on similarity of experience rather than on difference. They were both outsiders in a community that valued conformity. Both had found satisfaction in observation and understanding, rather than in the social connections that most people depended on for happiness. Both had learned to be alone without being lonely, to find companionship in work, and in the natural world when human companionship was unavailable or inadequate. Meeting each other was like finding a mirror that reflected not appearance but essence, showing them that they were not as unusual as they had believed, that somewhere in the world there was at least one other person who saw things the way they did. Wilhelm watched the developing relationship with satisfaction that he tried to hide, but which was obvious to anyone who knew him well. He had worried about Catherine's future, about what would happen to a woman who was too educated and too independent to fit easily into the role that society expected women to fill. The prospect of his daughter remaining unmarried had not troubled him as much as the prospect of her marrying someone who would expect her to stop being who she was in order to become who a wife was supposed to be. Caleb Mercer, whatever else he might be, was not a man who would try to diminish Catherine or redirect her intelligence toward domestic concerns that did not interest her. The courtship, such as it was, proceeded with the same methodical care that characterized everything both of them did. There were no dramatic gestures, no passionate declarations, no moments of overwhelming emotion that swept away reason and caution. Instead, there was a growing certainty that they fit together, that their partnership in work could extend to partnership in life, that building something together was more satisfying than building something alone. By late October, when the storage chambers were filling with the first deliveries from contracted families, both of them understood that marriage was not a question of if, but of when and on what terms. In late October, after the first major snow of the season had fallen and the storage chambers were full of vegetables from 18 different families, Caleb asked Catherine to marry him. The proposal was made in the cave, in the middle chamber where they had spent so many hours working together, and it was characteristically direct. "I think we should marry," he said, "if you agree." Catherine looked at him with the same assessing expression she had worn when she first visited the cave and said, "Why?" "Because we work well together," Caleb said. "Because you make me think better than I think alone. Because I want to build something that lasts and I want to build it with you." Catherine was quiet for a long moment and then she said, "I need to think about it." The answer was not what Caleb had expected, but it was honest, and he appreciated honesty more than he would have appreciated an immediate yes that was not fully considered. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "The offer stands." Catherine nodded and left, riding back to her father's farm through snow that was beginning to fall again, and Caleb went back to work on the inventory system he was developing, trying not to think about rejection and what it would mean for their partnership if she decided that marriage was a step too far. 3 days later, Catherine returned with her answer and with conditions. "I will marry you," she said, standing in the entrance to the cave with snow in her hair and determination in her voice. "But we continue the research. We publish our findings when the time is right. We teach others what we have learned. This is not just about building a business. It is about advancing knowledge. And I keep my own name for scientific publications. Catherine Brennan, not Catherine Mercer. In the work we do together, I want to be recognized as a partner, not as a wife." Caleb agreed to every condition without hesitation. The terms she set were reasonable, and they aligned with values he shared, even if he had not articulated them as clearly as she had. They would marry as intellectual equals, as partners in work and in life, building something together that was larger than what either of them could build alone. It was not the romantic ideal that songs were written about, but it was something more durable, based on respect and shared purpose, rather than on emotion that might fade when the first passion cooled. They were married on June 10, 1875, in a simple ceremony at the Lutheran church that served the scattered German families who had settled in the valley. Wilhelm Brennan officiated, exercising the clerical authority he held from his years of theological study in Germany, and he gave away his daughter with the satisfied expression of a man who had been waiting for someone intelligent enough to deserve her. 42 people attended, more than the usual population of Redstone Creek, coming from ranches and farms scattered across a territory where news traveled slowly but eventually reached everyone. They came not out of social obligation, but out of respect for what Caleb and Catherine had accomplished together, for the knowledge they had shared, and the help they had provided when help was desperately needed. The winter of 1875–76 was milder than the catastrophic winter that had preceded it, but the storage operation proved its value again. 28 families stored vegetables in the cave chambers, paying the agreed-upon rate of 60 cents per 100 pounds. The revenue for the season was $192, after expenses, a profit of approximately $145. The money was modest by the standards of successful ranching or timber operations, but it was earned through knowledge rather than through physical labor, and it proved that the business model was sustainable. More important than the profit was the expanding recognition that Caleb and Catherine's methods represented something new and valuable. Dr. Amos Lewis, a professor of geology from the recently established University of Wyoming, visited the cave in March of 1876 and spent 3 days taking measurements and rock samples, and talking with Caleb about the thermal properties of limestone and the principles of natural temperature regulation. Lewis was impressed enough to write an article for the Wyoming Agricultural Review describing what he called the Redstone Creek Natural Storage System, noting that the limestone formation dating to the Ordovician period, some 450 million years ago, had been shaped by groundwater into a network of chambers whose thermal properties were remarkably stable. The article brought visitors, farmers from neighboring counties who wanted to see the operation and learn whether similar caves existed on their own properties. Caleb and Catherine received letters from as far away as Montana and Colorado, asking for details about their methods and requesting advice on how to identify suitable caves and prepare them for storage. They answered every letter, Caleb providing the practical details of shelving design and ventilation engineering, Catherine explaining the scientific principles of thermal mass and humidity regulation. The knowledge they shared was given freely, without expectation of payment or competitive advantage, because both of them believed that wisdom hoarded was wisdom wasted. In the spring of 1876, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The news came as a surprise to both of them, not because they had taken precautions against pregnancy, but because they had not particularly thought about children beyond an abstract awareness that married couples typically had them. Catherine was 28, an age when many women had already borne multiple children, but she had spent her youth and young adulthood studying rather than preparing for motherhood. The pregnancy pleased Wilhelm, who wanted grandchildren, but it worried Catherine, who was not certain how a child would fit into the work she and Caleb were building together. Caleb's response was characteristically practical. "We will manage," he said. "Women have been having babies and continuing their work since the beginning of time. We will figure out how to do both." The reassurance was simple, but it was what Catherine needed: confirmation that pregnancy did not mean the end of their partnership or the diminishment of her role in the business and the research that meant as much to her as to him. They continued working together through the summer, Catherine's pregnancy showing only slightly by August, not enough to prevent her from climbing into the cave chambers and taking the measurements and making the observations that would eventually become part of the comprehensive documentation they were building. Their daughter was born in January of 1877, delivered by a midwife who came from the German community, and who stayed 3 days to help Catherine through the difficult transition from being a woman who studied plants to being a woman who was responsible for a human life. They named her Sarah, after Catherine's mother, who had died in Germany before the family immigrated, and she was a healthy baby who cried lustily and fed well, and gave every indication of having inherited her mother's strong constitution. The birth of Sarah changed the rhythm of their work, but it did not stop it. Catherine brought the baby to the cave when she needed to be there, bundling her against the cool air and creating a makeshift cradle from a wooden crate lined with blankets. Caleb took his turn caring for Sarah when Catherine needed both hands free for detailed work, holding the baby with the same careful attention he brought to measuring temperatures and recording data. They learned to work around the demands of parenthood, to accept that progress would be slower and interruptions would be frequent, but that the work would continue because it mattered, and because they had built something worth maintaining. In 1878, a second child arrived, a son they named Daniel after Wilhelm's father. Daniel was quieter than Sarah had been, more inclined to observe than to demand, and he fit into the family's pattern of work and study as though he had been designed for it. With 2 children, the cave house became more crowded, and Caleb began planning a proper home, something built above ground with rooms for sleeping and working and living that would give the family space to grow. The year 1878 also brought the first serious challenge to the storage business, arriving in the form of competition that promised to make Caleb and Catherine's natural methods obsolete before they had fully proven their value. The Wyoming Ice and Cold Storage Company opened a facility in Redstone Creek in early spring, building a large insulated structure on the edge of town where access was easy and visibility was high. The building was impressive by frontier standards, built from thick timber walls packed with sawdust insulation, with a raised floor to allow air circulation and massive doors that sealed tight to prevent heat infiltration. The company's agents canvassed the territory aggressively, visiting the same farms and ranches that Caleb and Catherine had visited, offering services that sounded more modern and more reliable than storage in a cave. The ice storage method was well established in eastern cities, where ice was cut from frozen lakes and rivers in winter, stored in insulated buildings, and used through summer to keep food cold in the days before mechanical refrigeration. The technology was proven and the principles were sound. Large blocks of ice, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were stacked in the storage building and separated by layers of sawdust that slowed melting. Food to be stored was kept in chambers adjacent to the ice, cooled by the cold air that radiated from the frozen blocks. The system worked as long as the ice supply lasted, and as long as the insulation was adequate to prevent excessive melting. The prices the ice storage company offered were competitive, 40 cents per 100 pounds compared to Caleb's 60 cents, and the convenience factor was significant. Farmers could deliver their vegetables to a location in town, rather than making the 3-mile journey up a steep trail to a cave that many still found unsettling. The company's advertising emphasized modernity and progress, suggesting that ice storage represented the future while cave storage was a primitive holdover from less enlightened times. The message resonated with people who wanted to believe that newer methods were automatically superior to older ones, that science and engineering could always improve on nature. 4 families who had stored with Caleb and Catherine in previous years decided to try the ice storage instead, attracted by the lower price and the implication that they would be participating in progress rather than clinging to outdated methods. The loss of 4 contracts meant a reduction in revenue of approximately $48 for the season, not catastrophic for a business that had been profitable for 3 consecutive years, but significant enough to worry Catherine, who understood that losing customers to competition could be the beginning of a decline that would be difficult to reverse. The debate between Caleb and Catherine about how to respond to the competition was the most intense disagreement they had experienced in their partnership. Catherine wanted to lower their prices to match the 40-cent rate, arguing that they needed to be competitive if they wanted to maintain their customer base. Caleb wanted to maintain their current price and trust in the superiority of their natural system, arguing that competing on price alone would reduce their already modest profit margins to the point where the business might not be sustainable. The argument stretched over several evenings, both of them presenting logical cases for their positions, neither willing to concede that the other might be right. The compromise they reached was characteristic of how they made decisions together. They would maintain their 60-cent price, but they would add value in ways that justified the higher cost. Caleb would offer consulting services to help customers select and prepare vegetables for optimal storage, teaching them which varieties stored best and how to harvest at the right stage of maturity. Catherine would provide detailed reports showing the exact temperature and humidity conditions their produce was stored under, documenting with scientific precision the care that went into maintaining optimal conditions. They would compete not on price but on quality and knowledge, trusting that customers who understood the difference between adequate storage and optimal storage would be willing to pay more for better results. The winter of 1878 to 79 was mild by Wyoming standards, the kind of winter that made people forget how brutal the weather could be when Arctic air settled over the high plains and refused to move. Temperatures rarely dropped below zero. Snow accumulation was manageable. Traditional root cellars that had been rebuilt with deeper excavations and better insulation performed adequately. The ice storage facility also performed well through fall and winter, maintaining temperatures in the low 40s, cold enough to keep vegetables dormant and fresh. But in July of 1879, when many families were still drawing on stored vegetables from the previous fall's harvest because spring planting had been delayed by late frost and summer crops were not yet ready, a prolonged heat wave struck the territory with an intensity that no one had experienced in living memory. The heat began in early July and built day by day, the temperature climbing from the 80s into the 90s, and finally breaking 100 degrees on July 15th. The heat was dry and relentless, the sun beating down from a cloudless sky, the air so hot that it hurt to breathe deeply. For 2 weeks the temperature never dropped below 80 degrees at night and regularly exceeded 95 degrees during the day. The effect on ice-based storage was catastrophic. Ice melts predictably under normal conditions, and the company had calculated its winter ice harvest based on historical data about summer temperatures and expected rates of melting. But 95-degree heat was not normal for Wyoming, where elevation and low humidity typically moderated summer extremes. The ice blocks, each weighing 300 pounds when they were cut from frozen lakes in January, were melting at twice the expected rate, bleeding water into drainage channels that struggled to carry away the volume of melt. By the end of the first week, the storage chambers were warming noticeably. The temperature, which should have been maintained at 45 degrees, had risen to 52 degrees. By the end of the second week, it had reached 58 degrees and was continuing to rise as the remaining ice supply dwindled. The company tried to compensate by restricting access to the storage chambers, by adding additional sawdust insulation, by every measure they could think of to slow the melting and preserve what ice remained. But the heat was relentless, and the ice was finite, and the mathematics of thermal transfer were unforgiving. Vegetables that had been stored since October began to show signs of stress. Potatoes developed soft spots. Turnips began to sprout. Onions that should have remained dormant started to break dormancy and send up green shoots. By the end of the heat wave, approximately 30% of the stored produce had spoiled or degraded enough to be unsuitable for use. The cave, by contrast, maintained its temperature exactly as it had for the previous 5 years. The main chamber stayed at 56 degrees regardless of whether the outside air was 95 degrees or 20 below zero. The thermal mass of the surrounding limestone was so enormous, millions of tons of rock that had stored heat and cold over geological time scales, that 2 weeks of surface heat made no measurable difference to the interior conditions. The vegetables Caleb and Catherine had stored in October were in perfect condition in July, firm and dormant, and completely unaffected by the weather that had destroyed a significant portion of the competing storage facilities' inventory. The failure of the ice storage during the heat wave brought back the 4 families who had switched to the commercial operation, and it brought new customers who had been skeptical of cave storage, but who now understood that natural systems had advantages that mechanical systems could not match. By the fall of 1879, Caleb and Catherine had contracts with 32 families, more than they had ever served before, representing a storage capacity that approached the maximum the existing chambers could hold. The revenue for the season was $246, and after expenses, the profit was $185, more than enough to support a comfortable life and to justify the expansion they had been planning. The ice storage company closed its Redstone Creek facility in 1880, unable to compete with a system that required no ice, no labor beyond the initial setup, and no ongoing management to prevent failure. The closure was not dramatic. The building was simply locked and abandoned, the massive insulated walls standing empty as a monument to the assumption that newer was always better than older, and that technology was always superior to nature properly understood. Caleb felt no satisfaction in the company's failure. Competition was not personal, and defeating a competitor was not the goal of what he and Catherine were building. The goal was to provide a service that worked reliably, to understand and use natural systems in ways that benefited people who needed what those systems could provide. If ice storage had proven superior to cave storage, he would have had to adapt or accept that his methods were inferior. But the heat wave had demonstrated what he had believed from the beginning, that geology was more reliable than mechanical engineering, when the task was maintaining stable temperatures regardless of outside conditions. The years that followed were years of steady growth and quiet satisfaction. The business expanded modestly, never growing so large that it lost the personal character that made it work, but growing enough to be sustainable and profitable. 2 more children were born, a daughter named Rebecca in 1881, and a son named Benjamin in 1885. The cave house became inadequate for a family of 6, and Caleb built a proper home on a flat bench of land just below the cave entrance, using timber from his own property and stone quarried from the cliff face, creating a structure that was solid and functional and large enough to accommodate the family's needs. Catherine continued her research and documentation, corresponding with agricultural scientists at universities in Wyoming and neighboring states, sharing data and methods, and learning from others who were working on similar problems of food preservation and storage. She published 2 papers in the Wyoming Agricultural Review, one on humidity regulation in natural cave environments, and another on the comparative shelf life of root vegetables stored under various conditions. The papers were cited by other researchers, and they established Catherine as a legitimate scientist, rather than merely as the wife of a cave keeper. Wilhelm Brennan lived with the family from 1880 until his death in 1883, spending his final years cataloging plant species that grew in and around the cave entrance, and teaching his grandchildren about botanical observation and the careful recording of natural phenomena. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71, content with the knowledge that his daughter had found a life that used her education and respected her intelligence. By 1885, 12 years after Caleb had first discovered the cave, and 10 years after he and Catherine had formalized their partnership, the Red Stone Creek Natural Storage Operation was established as a permanent feature of the territory's agricultural infrastructure. The business served 45 families regularly and provided storage for occasional customers who needed short-term help. The revenue was stable at approximately $320 per year, modest compared to successful ranching operations, but earned through knowledge rather than through the hard physical labor that broke men's bodies before they reached 50. More valuable than the money was the legacy being built. The cave that Nathaniel Mercer had given his youngest son as a puzzle, and a test had become something that served the community and demonstrated the value of observation and understanding. Caleb and Catherine had proven that natural systems properly used could outperform mechanical alternatives, that knowledge could be more valuable than tradition, that 2 people working together as equals could build something that neither could have built alone. The foundation they had laid would support not just their own lives, but the lives of their children and the children who came after, a legacy that would last as long as the limestone that held it. The years after 1885 were years of steady refinement rather than dramatic change, a time when the business that Caleb and Catherine had built became not just sustainable but established, part of the fabric of life in the territory rather than an experiment that might fail. The cave storage operation served between 40 and 50 families each season, the number fluctuating based on harvest yields and economic conditions, but remaining stable enough that Caleb and Catherine could predict with reasonable accuracy what their revenue would be and plan accordingly. The work had become routine in the best sense of the word, the kind of routine that comes from understanding a system so thoroughly that managing it requires attention but not constant problem solving. The children grew, each developing distinct personalities and interests that reflected different aspects of their parents' characters and their grandfather Wilhelm's influence. Sarah, the eldest, born in 1877, showed Catherine's scientific precision from an early age. By the time she was 8, she was keeping her own journal of observations, recording the behavior of birds that nested near the cave entrance, documenting the seasonal changes in vegetation on the hillside, asking questions that required careful thought to answer properly. She was quiet and methodical, more comfortable with notebooks and careful observation than with the rough play that other children engaged in, and she showed every sign of inheriting her mother's intellectual gifts. Daniel, born in 1878, had his father's quiet competence and his tendency to understand systems through patient observation rather than through formal study. He spent hours in the cave chambers as a boy, not playing but watching, learning through repetition and attention how the storage operation actually worked. By the time he was 10, he could check the thermometers and record the readings as accurately as Caleb could identify which vegetables were beginning to show signs of stress before visible deterioration began, could adjust the ventilation based on outside conditions without needing to be told what needed adjusting. He was being trained, though neither he nor Caleb thought of it as training, simply as learning by doing the work that needed to be done. Rebecca, born in 1881, inherited Wilhelm's love of plants and his careful way of cataloging the natural world. She spent her childhood wandering the hillside around the cave entrance, collecting specimens of every plant she could find, pressing them in the same kind of botanical press that Wilhelm had used, learning their proper names in Latin as well as their common names, understanding their relationships to each other and to the soil and climate that supported them. By the time she was 12, she had identified and documented 47 plant species growing within a mile of the cave, work that would have impressed university botanists if they had known about it. Benjamin, the youngest, born in 1885, was different from his siblings in ways that became clear as he grew older. Where Sarah was methodical and Daniel was observant and Rebecca was systematic, Benjamin was restless. He built things with whatever materials he could find, creating contraptions and mechanisms that sometimes worked and sometimes failed spectacularly, but which always showed an engineering mind that was looking for ways to improve on what existed rather than simply maintaining what was already adequate. He was fascinated by the machinery that was beginning to appear in Wyoming territory as railroads expanded and mining operations grew, fascinated by the power and precision that mechanical systems could achieve when properly designed. The difference between Benjamin and his older siblings became a source of quiet concern for Catherine as the boy reached his teenage years. Sarah was clearly headed toward academic study, talking already about wanting to attend the University of Wyoming where Dr. Lewis taught, and where she could pursue formal training in geology or natural science. Daniel was just as clearly preparing to take over the cave storage operation, learning every aspect of the business from inventory management to customer relations to the technical details of maintaining optimal storage conditions. Rebecca would likely follow Wilhelm's path into botanical work, possibly teaching or doing research at an agricultural station. But Benjamin showed no interest in the cave or in natural systems or in any of the work that the family had built their lives around. He wanted trains and machines, and the kind of progress that came from building new things rather than understanding old ones. The conversation that Caleb and Catherine had about Benjamin's future took place in the spring of 1899, when the boy was 14, and showing increasing resistance to spending time in the cave doing work he clearly found tedious. Catherine was worried that they were losing their youngest son to a world they did not understand, a world of mechanical engineering and industrial development that seemed to value innovation over observation and building over understanding. Caleb was more sanguine, remembering his own youth and the way his father had tried to force him into a mold that did not fit. "Every child has to find their own path," he said. "We cannot make Benjamin love the cave just because we love it. Maybe his path leads somewhere else." "But he is rejecting everything we have built," Catherine said. "Everything your father gave you. Everything we have proven about natural systems and patient observation. He wants machines and progress and all the things that will fail when conditions change the way the ice storage failed when the heat wave came." Caleb looked at his wife, seeing the genuine distress in her face, and chose his words carefully. "Maybe he is right to want machines," he said. "Maybe machines have a place alongside natural systems. We proved that nature works better than artificial ice for our purposes. That does not mean nature is always better for all purposes. The railroad serves a purpose we could never serve with caves and limestone. The conversation did not resolve the tension, but it established a principle that would guide how they handled Benjamin's growing independence. They would not force him to work in the cave if he did not want to. They would not insist that he value what they valued or build what they had built. They would give him the same gift that Nathaniel had given Caleb, the freedom to find his own way, even if that way led somewhere his parents did not understand or approve of. It was a harder gift to give than Caleb had expected, requiring a trust in his son's judgment that did not come naturally to a man who had spent his life perfecting systems through careful control. In the spring of 1900, when Benjamin was 15, he announced that he wanted to leave Wyoming and work for the Union Pacific Railroad. He had been corresponding with a recruiting office in Cheyenne, learning about apprenticeship programs for young men who wanted to train as mechanical engineers and railroad mechanics. The pay was modest, but it included housing and training, and the opportunity to work with the most advanced machinery that existed on the American frontier. It was everything Benjamin wanted, and nothing that his parents had imagined for him. The decision to let him go was painful for Catherine in ways that she could not fully articulate. She had assumed that all four of her children would stay close to home, would contribute to the family enterprise, would carry forward the work that she and Caleb had started. The idea that one of them would reject that work entirely felt like a rejection of her, like a judgment that what she had accomplished was not valuable enough to hold a child's interest. Caleb understood her pain, but he also understood Benjamin's need, having felt the same need himself to escape from expectations that did not match who he was. On a morning in late April 1900, with frost still on the ground but the promise of spring in the air, Caleb rode with Benjamin to the railroad depot in Redstone Creek, both of them silent for most of the journey because neither knew what to say, and because the things that mattered most were hardest to put into words. They rode through country that Caleb had known for nearly 3 decades, past farms where he had bought potatoes that first season, past the trail that led to the cave entrance, past landmarks that meant something to him, but which Benjamin probably saw as just scenery to leave behind. At the depot, with the train visible in the distance approaching with its plume of smoke and its promise of elsewhere and transformation, the silence between them grew heavy with all the things fathers and sons never quite managed to say to each other. Caleb dismounted and stood holding the reins, watching his youngest son check his traveling bag one more time, straighten his coat, try to look confident and adult when he was really just a 15-year-old boy stepping into a world he knew only from catalogs and recruitment letters. "You do not have to do this if you are not sure," Caleb finally said, knowing even as he said it that the words were more for himself than for Benjamin, were about his own need to offer an alternative rather than Benjamin's need to hear one. "There is work here if you want it. Good work. Work that matters." Benjamin looked at his father with an expression that mixed affection and frustration and determination in proportions that shifted as he considered how to respond honestly without being cruel. "I know," Benjamin said, "and I am grateful, truly. What you and Mother built here is amazing. What you proved about natural systems and observation and patience, that matters, and I understand that it matters. But this is not my work. The cave is perfect for what it does, but I want to build things that move, that change, that do things caves cannot do. I want to understand machines the way you understand geology. That is not better or worse, just different. Can you understand that?" Caleb could understand it because he remembered being young and wanting something different from what his father wanted for him, remembered the years of feeling like he did not fit into the expectations that seemed so clear to everyone else. The difference was that Nathaniel had tried to force conformity while Caleb was trying to allow freedom, but the underlying tension was the same, the the gap between what parents hoped for and what children needed. "I understand," he said, "and you are right. Different is not wrong. Your path is your path." "Then build what you want to build," Caleb said, and the words came easier now that the hardest part was acknowledged. "Build it well. And remember something your grandfather taught me even though he taught it by accident. Systems fail when they are pushed beyond what they were designed for. The ice storage company taught us that. They built a system that worked fine under normal conditions, but they did not plan for the heat wave. Whatever you build, build it with margin for the unexpected. Build it to handle conditions worse than you think you will face. That is how things last." Benjamin smiled, perhaps the first genuine smile Caleb had seen on his face in months, a smile that showed relief that his father was not going to fight him on this, that the leaving could be clean instead of bitter. "I will remember," he said. "I promise." The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a hiss of steam, and the conductor called for passengers to board. Benjamin picked up his bag and started toward the train, then turned back and did something he had not done since he was a small child. He hugged his father, quick and awkward but genuine, and said, "Thank you for letting me go." Caleb stood on the platform watching as the train pulled away, watching until it disappeared around the bend where the valley narrowed, and the tracks followed the river toward Cheyenne, and whatever future waited there. He stood there longer than he needed to, thinking about children and their paths, about the difference between holding on and letting go, about the strange pain that came from doing the right thing when the right thing hurt. Then he mounted his horse and rode back toward the cave, toward the work that was his work even if it was not Benjamin's, toward the life he had built from rocks and observation and patience. That same year brought news of Jackson's situation, delivered by a mutual acquaintance who had seen Caleb's eldest brother working as a ranch hand on a spread 30 miles north. Jackson, who had inherited the best land and the most cattle and who had seemed destined for prosperity, had lost everything in the slow, grinding way that debt and bad decisions and simple bad luck could destroy a man's fortune. The ranch he had inherited had been sold to pay creditors in 1895. The cattle that bore the Mercer brand had been dispersed or slaughtered. Jackson himself, now 65 years old and showing the effects of a hard life and harder drinking, was working for wages doing the same work he had supervised as a young man when the ranch was his, and the future seemed secure. Caleb rode to the ranch where Jackson was working and found his brother repairing fence line, swinging a post-hole digger with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done the same work 10,000 times before. Jackson looked up when Caleb approached, his face weathered and lined, his eyes showing a weariness that was more than physical exhaustion. "Little brother," he said, "come to see how far the mighty have fallen." Caleb dismounted and said, "Come to offer you work if you want it. The cave operation needs another pair of hands, and I pay fair wages." Jackson set down the post-hole digger and leaned against a fence post, breathing hard from exertion or emotion or both. "Why would you do that?" he said. "After everything. After I got the good land and wasted it. After I called you fool and laughed when you warned me about that winter. Why would you help me now?" Caleb looked at his brother and said what he had come to say. "Because you are my brother. Because I have more work than I can handle alone with Daniel still learning. Because everyone deserves a chance to start over when the first try does not work out." Jackson worked for Caleb from the summer of 1900 through the fall of 1902, nearly 3 years of steady employment doing the physical work that Caleb's aging body was finding increasingly difficult. He helped expand the storage capacity in the lower chambers that had been discovered so many years before. He built new shelving and improved the access ladder and hauled supplies up the trail from town. He worked hard and drank less and slowly regained some measure of the pride he had lost when his own enterprise failed. The relationship between the brothers was not warm, but it was respectful, based on the understanding that both of them had been tested by their inheritances and both had learned something from the testing, even if the lessons were different. In the winter of 1902, working in the cold, damp air of the cave chambers doing physical labor that was harder on his aging body than he wanted to admit, Jackson developed a cough that would not go away. At first it seemed like the kind of minor ailment that hard men ignored, the kind of thing that would pass with warm weather and rest. But the cough persisted through spring and into summer, growing worse rather than better, accompanied by weight loss and fatigue and night sweats that soaked through his blankets and left him shivering in the darkness. By summer it was clear to everyone, including Jackson himself, that the cough was consumption, the same disease that had killed their brother Robert 27 years before. Jackson grew thin and weak through the summer months, his breathing increasingly labored, his stamina diminishing week by week, until even light work left him exhausted and gasping. The strong man who had swung an axe and roped cattle and built fence line for 40 years was reduced to sitting in the shade watching others do work he could no longer manage. In October of 1902, knowing that he would not survive another winter and wanting to make peace with the life he had lived and the choices he had made, he asked Caleb to take him to the ranch house that had been their father's, the house that Jackson had lost to creditors 7 years before but which still stood empty, because no buyer had wanted property that came with so much debt and bitterness attached to it. They rode there together on a day when the autumn colors were at their peak, the aspen bright gold against the dark green of pine, the air crisp and clear with the kind of clarity that only comes when winter is approaching but has not yet arrived. They sat on the porch of that empty house, the floorboards worn smooth by decades of boots, the paint peeling from lack of care, looking out over land that Jackson had once owned and now belonged to a bank that had no use for it except as an asset on a ledger that would someday be sold at auction. Jackson was quiet for a long time, gathering strength or courage or both before he spoke. "I wasted it all," he finally said, his voice rough from the cough that never stopped. "Everything Father gave me. The land, the cattle, the easy inheritance that should have set me up for life. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I did not know anything except how to do what had always been done. And when conditions changed, when the blizzard came and the drought came and the market crashed, I had no idea how to adapt because I had never had to learn adaptation. I just did what Father did and assumed it would work because it had always worked before." Caleb listened without interrupting, understanding that his brother needed to say these things more than he needed to hear responses. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sounds of wind in the bare branches and the distant call of crows heading south before the coming winter. Finally, Caleb spoke, choosing his words with care because this might be the last real conversation they would have, and he wanted to get it right. "You lived your life," he said. "That is not waste. You made choices based on what you knew and what you believed. Some worked and some did not. That is true for everyone who tries to do anything." Jackson shook his head slowly, the motion clearly painful. "No," he said, "look at what you built. You took the worthless land and turned it into something that will last beyond your lifetime. You proved principles that other people are learning from. You built a business and a family and a legacy. I built nothing. I have no children, no property, no legacy to leave behind. When I die, there will be nothing to show I was ever here except debts that someone else paid." Caleb thought about legacies and what they meant, thought about his father's letter and the puzzle he had been given, thought about Catherine and the children and the business they had built together. Then he said something that surprised him even as he said it, a truth he had not fully understood until he needed to speak it aloud. "You taught me something important even if you did not mean to. You showed me what happens when a man is given what he thinks he wants without having to struggle for it. You showed me that easy gifts can be harder than hard gifts if a man does not learn to value what he has. You helped me understand my own inheritance better by showing me what the other choice looked like. That is a kind of legacy, even if it is not the kind you wanted to leave." Jackson looked at his younger brother with eyes that showed the fever that was burning through him and something else, something that might have been gratitude or might have been simply relief that his life had meant something even if it had not meant what he intended. "You really believe that," he said. "I do," Caleb said. "And I think Father would have too. He gave us what we needed, not what we wanted. You needed to learn that easy is not always better. I needed to learn that hard is not always worse. We both learned our lessons. The only difference is I got more time to use what I learned." Jackson died 2 weeks later, on November 1st, 1902, in the same ranch house where he had been born 67 years before. He was buried next to their parents in the family plot that overlooked the Sweetwater River, and Caleb was the only one who attended the burial besides the Lutheran minister, who said the words over the grave. Standing there in the November cold, Caleb thought about his brothers and about the three very different paths that had started from the same place. Robert had gotten the middle inheritance and had died at 36 from disease and disappointment. Jackson had gotten the best inheritance and had squandered it through overconfidence and bad luck. Caleb had gotten the worst inheritance and had turned it into something that would outlast all of them. The difference had not been in the gifts, but in what each man had made of what he was given. The year 1903 began with news that pleased Sarah and worried her parents in equal measure. She had been accepted to the University of Wyoming's geology program, one of only 3 women in a department that had never quite decided whether female students should be allowed to study rocks and minerals alongside the young men, who were assumed to be the proper inheritors of scientific knowledge. Sarah was 26 years old, older than most university students, but her years of careful observation and documentation had given her a foundation that formal education would build on rather than replace. She would leave in September for Laramie, where the university was located, joining Daniel, who was already managing the cave storage operation, and Rebecca, who was content to continue her botanical work from home. Caleb was proud of Sarah's acceptance, but he was also aware that at 61 years old he was no longer young, and that the work of managing the cave was becoming harder each year. His hands ached in the mornings from arthritis that was beginning to settle into his joints. His back complained when he bent to check the lower shelves. His knees protested when he climbed the ladder to the upper chambers. He was still capable of doing the work that needed to be done, but he could feel his body telling him that time was limited, that the day would come when someone else would have to take over completely. Catherine saw the signs as clearly as Caleb did. She was 55, still vigorous and still intellectually engaged with the research they continued to conduct, but she was also realistic about the future. "Daniel is ready," she said one evening in late summer as they sat outside the house watching the sun set over the valley. "He has been ready for 2 years. You are holding on because you do not want to let go, but the time for letting go is coming whether you want it or not." Caleb knew she was right, but the knowing did not make the letting go any easier. The cave had been his life's work, the thing that had defined him and proven his worth, and given meaning to an inheritance that everyone else had thought was worthless. In early September, with Sarah preparing to leave for university and the fall storage season approaching, Caleb experienced what he would later realize was a warning. He was working alone in the middle chamber, adjusting the ventilation channels before the first deliveries of vegetables arrived, when he felt a tightness in his chest that made breathing difficult. The tightness passed after a few minutes, but it left him shaken in a way that physical pain usually did not. He told Catherine about the incident that evening, and she insisted that he see a doctor, which he did, riding to town the next day to visit Dr. Harrison, who had replaced the old frontier doctor who had served the territory for decades. Dr. Harrison examined him thoroughly and delivered a diagnosis that was both expected and unwelcome. "Your heart is strained," he said. "Not failing yet, but showing signs that it will not last forever. You need to reduce the physical work you do. Stop lifting heavy loads. Stop climbing ladders if you can avoid it. Rest more than you work." The advice was sensible and completely impractical for a man whose work required exactly the things the doctor was telling him not to do. Caleb thanked Dr. Harrison and paid his fee, and rode home knowing that he would have to make decisions he had been avoiding. The conversation with Daniel happened that same evening, father and son sitting in the cave's main chamber where they had sat together hundreds of times before. "I need you to take over more of the operation," Caleb said. "The physical work anyway. I can still do the planning and the customer relations and the record keeping, but the lifting and the ladder climbing and the hauling need to be your responsibility now." Daniel, who was 25 and had been preparing for this moment without knowing exactly when it would come, nodded and said, "I can do that. I have been doing most of it already this past year." "It is more than just doing the work," Caleb said. "It is understanding why the work matters. Understanding that we are not just storing vegetables. We are proving that natural systems work. That observation and patience matter. That knowledge is more valuable than tradition when tradition is based on assumptions that are not questioned." Daniel looked at his father and said, "I know. You have been teaching me that since I was old enough to hold a thermometer. I will not forget." The fall of 1903 proceeded normally, or as normally as any season had proceeded since Caleb had started storing vegetables 30 years before. 43 families delivered their produce to the cave for storage. The shelves filled with potatoes and turnips and carrots and onions. The thermometers read their steady 56 degrees in the main chamber, 53 in the deep chamber, 48 in the lower level that was now being used regularly for apple and dairy storage. The business ran smoothly because Daniel had learned well, and because Caleb had built systems that did not depend on any one person knowing everything. On September 12, 1903, Caleb woke early as he always did and made his morning rounds of the chambers as he had done for 30 years. He checked the thermometers and recorded the readings in the journal that now had 30 volumes, one for each year of operation. He examined the first deliveries of the season's vegetables, looking for signs of damage or disease that would require removing affected produce before it could spread. He adjusted the ventilation in the middle chamber where the humidity was slightly higher than optimal. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be. That afternoon he sat on the porch of the house he had built, reading a new volume on soil chemistry that Daniel had ordered from a catalog, a book that discussed the latest findings about how minerals moved through soil and how different crops affected soil composition over time. Catherine was inside preparing supper. The children were scattered doing their various works, Sarah packing for her departure to university, Daniel in town buying supplies, Rebecca in the greenhouse tending to seedlings. The day was warm for September, the sun strong enough to make sitting in shade preferable to sitting in direct light. Caleb read for an hour, following each sentence the way he had followed cave passages all those years before, patiently and attentively, certain that there was always more to find if a man looked carefully enough. Then he closed his eyes, meaning to rest them for a moment before continuing, and he did not open them again. Catherine found him there 20 minutes later when she came to tell him that supper was ready. He was sitting peacefully with the book open on his lap, his expression calm, looking like a man who had simply finished reading and decided to rest before moving on to the next chapter. He was 61 years old, not young but not particularly old either by the standards of men who lived careful lives and avoided the kinds of risks that killed frontiersmen early. He had lived to see his children grown and his business established, and his methods proven beyond any reasonable doubt. He had lived to understand that his father's gift, which had seemed like punishment, had been the greatest gift any of his father's sons had received. He had lived to build something that would outlast him, not just a business but a way of understanding the world, an approach to problems that valued observation over assumption and patience over haste. The funeral was held 4 days later at the Lutheran church, with more than 100 people in attendance from all across the territory and beyond. The people who came were mostly those who had stored vegetables in the cave over the years, families whose children had not gone hungry because one man had understood geology and had been willing to share what his understanding produced. But there were also scientists who had corresponded with Caleb and Catherine, professors from the University of Wyoming and agricultural researchers from Montana and Colorado who had read their papers and learned from their methods. There were young men who had worked for Caleb over the years, learning not just how to store vegetables but how to approach problems with systematic observation rather than with guesswork. Catherine spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite her grief, saying what needed to be said about the man she had spent 28 years building a life with. He was not a great man, she said. He was a good man. The difference matters. Great men change the world through force of personality or force of will. Good men change the world through quiet persistence and careful attention to truth. Caleb changed the world by understanding it and by teaching others to understand it. That is a legacy that will last longer than monuments or fortune. He was buried on the hillside above the cave entrance, in a spot he had chosen years before because it offered a view of the valley and the mountains beyond. The headstone was simple granite carved with his name and the dates of his life and a single line that Catherine had chosen. He listened to the mountain. The words were simple, but they captured something essential about who he had been and what he had accomplished. Daniel took over the operation completely, running it with the same careful attention that his father had brought to every aspect of the work. Sarah returned from university each summer to help with the busiest seasons, bringing new knowledge from her geological studies and applying it to improve the ventilation and temperature control systems. Rebecca developed a side business growing medicinal herbs using techniques she had learned from studying Wilhelm's notes, selling to doctors and pharmacists throughout the territory. Benjamin, working for the Union Pacific in Cheyenne, designed an improved loading mechanism for freight cars, earning a promotion and a modest increase in pay, and the satisfaction of building something that moved and changed and did things that caves could not do. The cave operation continued without interruption through the decades that followed Caleb's death. The business that he and Catherine had started in 1874 was still operating in 1920 when Sarah's daughter took over management. It was still operating in 1950 when Sarah's granddaughter modernized the record-keeping system and installed electric lighting in the chambers, while maintaining the natural temperature regulation that had always been the system's greatest strength. It was still operating in 1980 when the cave was designated a historical site by the state of Wyoming, recognized for its role in demonstrating the value of natural systems and scientific observation. Catherine lived until 1921, dying at the age of 74, still conducting research and still corresponding with scientists who were interested in the principles she and Caleb had proven. She published a final paper 6 months before her death, summarizing 30 years of temperature and humidity data, demonstrating with incontrovertible evidence that limestone caves maintained more stable storage conditions than any artificial system yet developed. The paper was cited for decades afterward by researchers studying food preservation and natural climate control systems. In 2023, 150 years after Caleb Mercer had first discovered the cave and understood its potential, the operation was still running. The business had changed ownership several times, passing through multiple generations of the Mercer family, before being sold to a collective of organic farmers who valued the natural storage method and the historical continuity it represented. The cave chambers still maintained temperatures between 54 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of outside conditions, just as they had when Caleb first measured them in 1873. The massive thermal mass of the surrounding limestone, millions of tons of rock laid down in an ancient sea 450 million years before, continued to do what it had always done, holding heat in winter and coolness in summer, creating an environment that human engineering could not improve on. The shelving in the main chamber was modern now, metal instead of oak, but it still followed Caleb's original design principles, raised 6 inches off the floor on footings that allowed air circulation, space to prevent moisture buildup, arranged to facilitate regular inspection and rotation of stored produce. The ventilation system had been enhanced with small electric fans that supplemented the natural convection, but the basic principle of using differential pressure to create airflow remained unchanged from what Caleb and Catherine had engineered in 1874. The business served 45 families in 2023, almost exactly the same number it had served in 1885 when Caleb was approaching the end of his active involvement. The families were different, their motivations were different, but the fundamental need remained the same. People who wanted to store food without refrigeration, who valued organic produce that was kept fresh without chemicals, who appreciated the historical continuity of using a system that had worked for a century and a half without requiring technological updates or mechanical maintenance. The cave had become something more than just a storage facility. It had become a teaching site, a place where school groups came to learn about geology and natural systems and the history of food preservation in Wyoming. It had become a tourist attraction, modest but steady, drawing visitors who were interested in seeing a working example of how observation and patience could create solutions that lasted longer than the most advanced technology. It had become a monument, though not the kind that required stone or bronze, a monument to the principle that understanding how the world actually worked was more valuable than assuming how it should work based on tradition or convenience. In the small museum that had been built adjacent to the cave entrance, visitors could see Caleb's original journals, 30 volumes of careful daily observations spanning 3 decades. They could see the thermometers he had used, mercury instruments that were less precise than modern digital sensors, but which had been accurate enough to document the principle that mattered. They could see photographs of Caleb and Catherine, of their children, of the families who had stored vegetables through the brutal winter of 1873 and 1874. They could see copies of the papers Catherine had published, of the letters Caleb had answered, of the documentation that proved the cave system worked not through luck, but through understanding. The final exhibit in the museum was a simple display, a glass case containing the letter that Nathaniel Mercer had written to his youngest son, the letter that revealed the puzzle had been intentional, and the hard gift had been given in faith rather than in punishment. Next to the letter was a photograph of the 3 Mercer brothers taken in 1873, before the inheritance was divided, showing 3 young men who had no idea how different their lives would become based on what they received and what they made of it. Below the photograph was a placard with a quote from Catherine's final paper, words she had written 6 months before her death as her summary of what she and Caleb had accomplished together. We proved that natural systems, properly understood, are more reliable than mechanical systems designed to replicate what nature does effortlessly. We proved that observation matters more than assumption. We proved that patience and careful attention can accomplish what force and hurry cannot. These are principles that apply far beyond the storage of vegetables. They are principles for living. On a September afternoon in 2023, a tour guide named Emma Mercer, 24 years old and the great-great-great-granddaughter of Caleb and Catherine, led a group of visitors through the cave chambers, explaining the history and the science with the same careful attention to detail that her ancestors had brought to the work. She showed them the main chamber where the temperature was 56 degrees exactly as it had been 150 years before. She showed them the shelving that followed Caleb's original design principles, even though the materials were modern. She showed them the journal entry from October 19, 1873, displayed under glass, where Caleb had written that the town called him Cave Fool and he had written let them. A visitor asked the question that visitors always asked. What is the lesson? What are we supposed to learn from this? Emma thought for a moment, considering how to answer in a way that captured what mattered most. My great-great-great-grandfather was given land that everyone thought was worthless, she said. He could have accepted that judgment and lived a bitter life resenting what he did not receive. Instead, he looked at what he had and asked what it could do. He observed. He measured. He tested, he learned, and he discovered that what everyone thought was worthless was actually more valuable than what everyone thought was valuable. She paused, looking around at the cave chamber with its smooth limestone walls and its careful organization, and its quiet demonstration of principles that had outlasted the man who discovered them. The lesson is not about caves or vegetables, she said. The lesson is about how you approach the world. Do you assume you know what has value, or do you observe carefully and let the truth reveal itself? Do you follow tradition because it is tradition, or do you test whether tradition still works under current conditions? Do you keep knowledge to yourself, or do you share it so that others can build on what you learned? The group filed out, heading to the museum to see the exhibits and the photographs and the letter that Nathaniel had written. Emma stayed behind for a moment, checking the thermometer out of habit even though she knew what it would read. 56 degrees. The same temperature it had been when Caleb Mercer first hung a thermometer in this chamber 150 years ago. The same temperature it would be next week and next year, and probably next century if the cave endured, and people continued to value what natural systems could provide. She walked to the entrance and stood looking out over the valley where the town of Redstone Creek had grown from a frontier settlement of 40 families to a modern community of 2,000 people. The land had changed. The people had changed. But the limestone held its temperature, and the principles that Caleb had discovered remained as true as they had ever been. Observation mattered more than assumption. Patience accomplished what hurry could not. Natural systems, properly understood, outlasted mechanical systems designed to force nature into patterns it did not naturally follow. Emma locked the cave entrance and walked to her truck, carrying with her the same leather-bound journal that Caleb had carried, making her daily entry in the same careful script that recorded temperatures and observations and the small details that might someday matter to someone trying to understand how the system worked. The journal entry for September 12, 2023, exactly 120 years after Caleb's death, read simply, Main chamber 56 degrees. Middle chamber 53 degrees. Lower chamber 48 degrees. 42 families storing this season. The mountain holds, the principle endures.